Chapter 1. The Hidden Photograph. The House at Number 12. Grimmauld Place still felt like a mausoleum to Harry, even 3 months after inheriting it from Sirius. Every creak of the floorboards seemed to echo with his godfather's laughter. Every shadow in the corridors held the shape of memories that would never be made. But it was his now, along with all its secrets, and Harry had finally decided it was time to face them properly. Christmas break had arrived with its usual mixture of relief and melancholy. Relief because it meant escaping the increasingly oppressive atmosphere at Hogwarts, where Snape's potions lessons had become exercises in barely controlled animosity, and where the spectre of Voldemort's return hung over everything like a persistent storm cloud. Melancholy because Christmas at Grimmauld Place meant confronting the reality that Sirius would never again argue with his mother's portrait or grumble about the house elf heads mounted on the wall. Hermione had arrived 2 days after term ended, her arms laden with books about household management spells, and her hair looking more frazzled than usual from the December wind. Ron had followed the next morning, complaining loudly about having to leave the warmth of the burrow, but secretly eager for any excuse to avoid his mother's increasingly pointed questions about his future career plans. Right then, Hermione announced on their 3rd day together, consulting a list she'd made in her neat, precise handwriting. We should start with Regulus's old room. Mrs. Black mentioned it was where he kept most of his personal belongings, and if we're going to make this place properly livable, we need to clear out everything that might be cursed, charmed, or just generally unpleasant. Ron looked deeply skeptical. Why can't we just leave it alone? I mean, dead people's rooms are supposed to stay untouched, aren't they? Like monuments or something? This isn't a museum, Ron, Harry said, though his voice lacked conviction. The truth was, he wasn't entirely sure he wanted to disturb Regulus's belongings either. There was something unsettling about sorting through the remnants of a life cut short, especially when that life belonged to someone who had died trying to destroy the same evil that was now hunting Harry himself. But Hermione had already started up the stairs, her footsteps echoing with determination, and Harry found himself following. He had learned, over the years, that resisting Hermione's organizational impulses was generally futile, and besides, she was probably right. The house would never feel like home as long as it remained a shrine to the Black family's complicated history. Regulus's room was on the 3rd floor, at the end of a corridor lined with portraits whose occupants had long since abandoned their frames for more hospitable accommodations. The door bore an elaborate silver nameplate, slightly tarnished with age, and when Harry turned the handle, it opened with the soft sigh of a room that had been holding its breath for 20 years. The space beyond was larger than Harry had expected, with tall windows that looked out over the London skyline and walls lined with dark wooden bookshelves. A 4-poster bed dominated one corner, its hangings a deep forest green that reminded Harry uncomfortably of the Slytherin dormitories. Everything was covered in a fine layer of dust that caught the weak December sunlight like powdered silver. "Well," Ron said, peering around Harry's shoulder. "At least it doesn't smell like anything's died in here recently." Hermione shot him a disapproving look and began pulling protective gloves from her beaded bag. "We'll need to be systematic about this. Books first. Some of them might be cursed, so we'll check each one individually. Then the desk, the wardrobe, and finally anything stored under the bed or in trunks." They worked in companionable silence for the better part of an hour. Most of the books proved to be harmless, advanced texts on transfiguration and defense against the dark arts, a few volumes on magical theory that made Hermione's eyes light up with interest, and a surprising number of Muggle classics that seemed oddly out of place in the home of the noble and most ancient House of Black. "Look at this," Hermione said, holding up a leather-bound copy of Great Expectations. Regulus read Dickens. I wouldn't have expected that from someone in this family. Harry paused in his examination of what appeared to be a journal written entirely in code. Maybe that's why he turned against Voldemort in the end. Hard to believe in blood purity when you've read about how wrong people can be about each other. It was Ron who discovered the secret compartment in the desk. He had been half-heartedly rifling through the drawers, complaining about the number of broken quills and dried-up ink bottles, when his fingers caught on something that didn't quite fit. The back panel of the deepest drawer shifted under pressure, revealing a narrow space behind it. "Bloody hell," he muttered. "There's something back here." Harry and Hermione crowded around as Ron carefully extracted a small wooden box, its surface inlaid with mother-of-pearl in a pattern of stars and crescent moons. It was the kind of thing that might have held jewelry, or perhaps important documents, intimate enough to hide, valuable enough to preserve. "Should we open it?" Harry asked, though his hands were already reaching for the delicate silver clasp. "Carefully," Hermione warned. "It might be warded." But when Harry lifted the lid, the only thing that emerged was the faint scent of old parchment and pressed flowers. Inside, nestled in faded blue velvet, lay a collection of photographs, letters, and what appeared to be a few small keepsakes, the kind of treasures that accumulate in the private corners of a person's life. Harry lifted the first photograph with fingers that trembled slightly, expecting to see images of the Black family, or perhaps Regulus's Hogwarts friends. Instead, he found himself staring at a picture that made no sense at all. It was clearly very old. The colours had faded to the soft pastels of memories, and the edges were worn smooth from handling. But the subjects were unmistakable. A young girl with brilliant red hair, her face bright with laughter, sitting on a playground swing. Beside her, close enough that their shoulders were touching, sat a thin boy with dark hair that hung in his eyes. He was smiling, actually smiling, with genuine happiness rather than the cold satisfaction Harry had sometimes seen cross his face in the present day. The girl was unmistakably his mother. Even at 9 or 10 years old, Lily Evans had possessed the same warm green eyes, the same generous smile, the same way of holding her head, slightly tilted when she was listening to something interesting. Harry had seen enough photographs of her to recognize those features, even softened by childhood and time. The boy was unmistakably Severus Snape. Harry's hands went numb. The photograph fluttered toward the floor, and he caught it just in time, his reflexes working independently of his frozen brain. This had to be some kind of mistake, some trick of the light, or a resemblance so strong it had confused him. Because there was absolutely no way that his mother, his kind, brave, wonderful mother, had ever sat that close to Professor Snape, looking that comfortable, that happy. "Harry," Hermione's voice came from very far away. "Harry, what is it? You've gone completely white." He couldn't speak, couldn't even gesture toward the photograph. Instead, he held it out with a hand that shook visibly, watching as Hermione's expression shifted from concern to confusion, to the same stunned disbelief that was currently paralyzing his own thoughts. "That's your mother," she said slowly, as if saying the words aloud might make them less impossible. "And that's Snape," Harry managed, his voice cracking slightly on the name. Ron, who had been examining the other contents of the box, looked up sharply. "What? Let me see." He took the photograph from Hermione's nerveless fingers, studied it for a long moment, then shook his head. "So what? Kids play together all the time. Doesn't mean anything." But Harry could see that it did mean something. Everything about the image spoke of familiarity, of comfort, of a friendship that had been built over time and shared experiences. The way Lily was leaning against Snape's shoulder, the way his hand rested casually on the chain of her swing, the way they were both laughing at something beyond the frame. These weren't the interactions of strangers or casual acquaintances. "Look at the back," Hermione said quietly. Harry turned the photograph over with hands that felt disconnected from his body. In faded blue ink, someone had written, "Lily and Sev, summer 1969, best friends forever." The handwriting was young, careful, clearly that of a child, and the date made Harry's stomach twist with implications he didn't want to consider. 1969 would have made them 9 years old. 2 years before Hogwarts, when they were still just children in a Muggle neighborhood, before houses and blood status and dark magic had any meaning at all. "There's more," Ron said, his earlier dismissiveness replaced by something approaching fascination. The box yielded several more photographs, each one a small shock to Harry's understanding of the world. Snape and Lily walking together down a tree-lined street, their school bags slung over their shoulders. Snape showing Lily something in his hand while she watched with rapt attention. Lily laughing, while Snape looked on with an expression of such unguarded affection that it made Harry's chest ache with recognition. And then there were the letters. Not many. 3 or 4 pieces of parchment, folded carefully and tied with a ribbon that had once been green but had faded to the color of old moss. Hermione untied them with the reverent care of an archaeologist handling ancient artifacts. The first was brief, written in the same careful child's handwriting as the photograph inscription. "Dear Sev, thank you for teaching me about magic. I can't wait to learn more. I think you're the cleverest person I know. Love, Lily." The second was longer, more mature, clearly written during their Hogwarts years. "Severus, I know the other Gryffindors don't understand our friendship, and I know your house makes things complicated, but I want you to know that I don't care what anyone else thinks. You were my first friend in this world, and that means something. Please don't let them change who you are." Harry stopped reading. His vision had gone blurry, and he realized with distant surprise that his eyes were filling with tears. Not tears of sadness exactly, but of something more complex. Grief for a friendship he had never known existed, confusion about everything he had believed about his mother and Snape, and a strange, aching sympathy for the boy in the photographs who had looked so genuinely happy. "Harry," Hermione said gently, "perhaps we should stop for now. This is a lot to process." But Harry couldn't stop. In the bottom of the box, wrapped in tissue paper that crumbled at his touch, lay a pressed flower. A lily. How perfect, how impossibly perfect, its petals brown with age, but still recognizably delicate, still holding the ghost of its original beauty. "She gave him a flower," Harry whispered, and the words sounded strange in the dusty silence of the room. "She gave Snape a flower, and he kept it." Ron had gone very quiet, his earlier skepticism replaced by something approaching understanding. Even he, with his sometimes limited imagination, could see the significance of a pressed flower kept for 20 years, hidden in a secret compartment like the most precious of treasures. "Maybe," Hermione said carefully. "Maybe we should ask someone about this. Professor McGonagall, or Lupin, or—" "No." The word came out sharper than Harry had intended, but he couldn't help it. The idea of discussing this discovery with anyone else felt like a violation of something private, something that belonged to his mother and to the thin, dark-haired boy who had treasured her friendship enough to preserve these fragments of it. "No, not yet. I need to understand this first." He gathered the photographs and letters back into the box, his movements careful and deliberate. Each item felt impossibly fragile, as if it might disintegrate if handled too roughly, taking with it the only evidence that this impossible friendship had ever existed. "But Harry," Hermione pressed, "this changes things. If Professor Snape and your mother were friends—" "I know what it changes," Harry interrupted. He closed the box and held it against his chest, feeling the weight of its contents like a physical pressure over his heart. "I know exactly what it changes." Because he did know, even if he couldn't yet bring himself to articulate it. If Snape had been Lily's friend, her first friend in the magical world, according to her letter, then everything Harry thought he understood about their relationship, about Snape's hatred of him, about the reasons behind every cruel word and unfair detention, suddenly became infinitely more complicated. The boy in the photographs had loved Lily Evans. Not romantically, perhaps, they had been too young for that, but with the pure, uncomplicated devotion of a child who had found someone who understood him. And Harry, with his black hair and his father's face, must be a constant reminder of everything Snape had lost. They finished clearing Regulus's room in subdued silence, but Harry's attention kept drifting to the box tucked safely in his jacket pocket. Every time he moved, he could feel it pressing against his ribs, a small but insistent reminder that the world was not what he had thought it was. That evening, after Ron and Hermione had gone to their respective rooms, Harry sat alone in the kitchen of Grimmauld Place, the box open on the table before him. He had arranged the photographs in chronological order, creating a timeline of a friendship he had never imagined could exist. The progression was heartbreaking in its innocence. Two children discovering magic together, learning to navigate a world that was bigger and stranger than anything they had imagined. A boy teaching a girl about the wonders of the wizarding world, and a girl giving a boy the gift of her uncomplicated acceptance. And then, somewhere in the later photographs, a subtle shift, the easy closeness beginning to strain under pressures Harry could only guess at. The last photograph was different from the others. It showed Snape and Lily standing apart, no longer touching, their smiles forced and uncomfortable. Lily's eyes held a sadness that made Harry's chest tighten with recognition. It was the same expression he had seen in his own reflection after difficult conversations with Ron or Hermione, the look of someone trying to bridge a gap that seemed to widen with every word. On the back of this final photograph, someone had written in a different hand, older, more angular. Some things cannot be forgiven. Some words, once spoken, change everything. Harry stared at those words until they blurred together, wondering who had written them, and what words could have been so terrible that they had ended a friendship that had clearly meant everything to both children involved. He thought about the letters, about the pressed flower, about the careful way someone, Snape, Regulus, someone else entirely, had preserved these memories. And then he thought about Snape himself, about the cold, sardonic man who had made Harry's life miserable for 5 years, and tried to reconcile that image with the happy boy in the photographs. Somewhere between the playground swings and the Hogwarts dungeons, something had gone terribly wrong. Harry picked up the first photograph again, the one of Lily and Snape on the swings, both of them laughing at something beyond the frame, and studied Snape's face. The happiness there was so genuine, so unguarded, that it was almost painful to look at. This was what Severus Snape looked like when he was truly content, when he was with someone who saw past his awkwardness and his poverty and his strange intensity to the lonely boy underneath. When had that happiness disappeared? And how much of its loss was connected to Lily's death? Harry closed his eyes and tried to imagine Snape receiving news that Lily Evans Potter had been murdered by Voldemort. He tried to imagine what it would feel like to learn that his first friend, his childhood companion, the girl who had given him a pressed flower and called him clever, was gone forever. The grief would have been unbearable, but worse than grief would have been the guilt. Because if the rumors were true, if Snape had indeed been a Death Eater, then he would have known that his choices had put Lily in danger. He would have known that by following Voldemort, he had aligned himself with the very people who wanted to destroy everything she represented. Harry opened his eyes and found himself staring at his own reflection in the dark kitchen window. His mother's eyes looked back at him, green and bright and questioning, and for the first time he thought he understood why Snape could barely stand to look at him. It wasn't just that Harry looked like James Potter, though that was certainly part of it. It was that Harry was a living reminder of what Snape had lost, of the friendship he had destroyed, of the girl who had died while he was on the wrong side of a war that had consumed everything they had once shared. The pressed lily lay beside the photographs, its brown petals catching the lamplight like fragments of autumn. Harry touched it gently, wondering if Snape knew these items existed, if he had any idea that someone, probably Regulus, given the hiding place, had thought this friendship important enough to preserve. Probably not. Snape had always struck Harry as someone who believed he deserved whatever pain the past had inflicted on him, someone who would be more likely to destroy these memories than to treasure them. But Harry wasn't going to destroy them. Whatever had happened between his mother and Professor Snape, whatever words had been spoken that changed everything, these photographs represented something real and valuable, a connection between two lonely children who had found magic together, who had been friends before the world taught them they were supposed to be enemies. Harry carefully returned the items to their box, his movements reverent. Tomorrow he would have to decide what to do with this knowledge, whether to confront Snape, or to seek answers from someone else, or to simply carry this new understanding with him like the secret it had been for so many years. But tonight, in the quiet kitchen of a house that held too many secrets already, Harry allowed himself to grieve for the friendship his mother had lost, for the boy Snape had been before the world had hardened him into the man who now made Harry's life so difficult. And as he sat there, surrounded by the ghosts of Grimmauld Place and the echoes of a childhood connection he had never known existed, Harry found himself wondering if understanding someone's pain made their cruelty any easier to bear, or if it only made everything infinitely more complicated. The photograph of two children on swings seemed to shimmer in the lamplight, their laughter forever frozen in a moment when the future still held infinite possibilities, when friendship seemed simple, and magic was just beginning to reveal its wonders. Harry closed the box and held it close, feeling the weight of 20 years of secrets pressing against his chest, knowing that tomorrow everything would be different. Everything always was, after you learned the truth. Chapter 2. Seeking Answers. The return to Hogwarts after Christmas break felt different to Harry, as if the castle's familiar stones had shifted slightly while he was away, revealing new angles and unexpected shadows. The photographs from Regulus's hidden box remained carefully tucked inside his trunk, wrapped in one of his own shirts to protect them from the rough handling of house elves and the general chaos of dormitory life, but their presence seemed to radiate outward, colouring everything he saw with questions he had never thought to ask. It was Hermione who noticed the change first, of course. She had always been unnaturally perceptive when it came to shifts in her friends' emotional landscapes, and Harry's current state of distracted confusion was apparently impossible to hide from someone who had known him for 6 years. "You've been staring at the same page for 20 minutes, she observed quietly, settling beside him at their usual table in the common room. The fire crackled in the grate nearby, casting dancing shadows across her concerned face. "And unless transfiguration theory has suddenly become the most fascinating subject in the world, I suspect your mind is elsewhere entirely." Harry glanced down at his textbook and realized she was right. The words on the page had long since stopped making sense, replaced by an endless loop of questions about playground swings and pressed flowers, and the careful way someone had written "best friends forever" on the back of a photograph that challenged everything he thought he knew about the world. "I need to show you something," he said, his voice lower than he had intended. "But not here. Too many people around." Ron was across the room, engaged in what appeared to be a heated discussion with Seamus about Quidditch strategies, his voice carrying over the general hubbub of students catching up on holiday gossip and last-minute homework. Harry was grateful for the distraction. This conversation required Hermione's particular brand of analytical intelligence, and Ron's tendency toward immediate emotional reactions would only complicate things. They made their way up to the boys' dormitory, where Harry's trunk sat at the foot of his four-poster bed like a guardian of secrets. His dorm mates were all downstairs, giving them the privacy Harry desperately needed for this conversation. The late afternoon light filtering through the windows felt somehow appropriate, soft and muted, the kind of illumination that made confidences seem safe and revelation possible. Harry withdrew the small wooden box from its hiding place among his belongings, his hands trembling slightly as he set it on his bedspread. Even now, days after the initial discovery, the weight of its contents felt almost unbearable, not because the items themselves were heavy, but because they carried the accumulated gravity of 20 years of hidden truth. "Harry," Hermione said softly, her eyes widening as she recognized the careful way he was handling the container. "What did you find?" Instead of answering, Harry opened the box and withdrew the first photograph, the one of his mother and Snape on the playground swings, their faces bright with uncomplicated childhood happiness. He handed it to Hermione without ceremony, watching her expression shift from curiosity to confusion, to the same stunned disbelief that had paralyzed him in Regulus's dusty bedroom. "That's impossible," she whispered, turning the photograph over to read the inscription on the back. "Harry, this has to be some kind of mistake. Maybe it's someone who just looks like Professor Snape, or—" "It's him," Harry interrupted. "I've looked at it 100 times. I've compared it to every photograph I've ever seen of him. It's definitely Snape." Hermione set the first image aside with reverent care and accepted the next one. Snape and Lily walking together, their school bags slung over their shoulders, their conversation so animated that it seemed to spill out of the frozen moment and into the present. Then the letters, with their careful child's handwriting and their references to magic lessons and friendship that transcended house boundaries. "My God," Hermione breathed, her academic mind clearly racing to process the implications. "Harry, if this is real, and I'm not saying it isn't, but if it is, then everything we thought we knew about Professor Snape and your mother is wrong," Harry finished. "Completely, totally wrong." Hermione spent the next hour examining each item with the methodical thoroughness that had made her the brightest witch of their generation. She scrutinized the photographic paper, noting its age and composition. She analyzed the ink used in the letters, comparing it to samples in her reference books. She even cast a few discreet detection charms, checking for signs of magical manipulation or forgery. "It's authentic," she concluded finally, her voice filled with something approaching awe. "All of it. These photographs were taken in the late 1960s, probably with a standard Muggle camera. The paper matches the chemical processes used during that period, and there are no signs of magical enhancement or alteration. The letters are genuine as well. The ink, the parchment, even the way the words have faded over time." Harry felt a strange mixture of relief and dread at her confirmation. Part of him had been hoping that some technical detail would prove the whole thing to be an elaborate hoax, freeing him from the necessity of reconciling these images with everything he had experienced in Snape's presence. But another part of him, the part that had been studying the happiness in young Severus's face, would have been devastated if the friendship had proved to be false. "So they were really friends," he said, the words feeling strange and foreign in his mouth. "Before Hogwarts, before everything went wrong, my mother and Severus Snape were actually friends." "More than friends, I think," Hermione said softly, holding up the letter where Lily had written about Snape being the cleverest person I know. "Harry, look at the way she writes about him. This isn't the casual affection of children who happen to live in the same neighborhood. This is the deep attachment of someone who genuinely admires and cares for another person." They spent the rest of the evening in the library, ostensibly working on homework, but actually conducting carefully disguised research into the backgrounds of Harry's parents. Hermione proved to be a natural detective, following trails of information with the same intensity she brought to her academic studies. It was in a collection of old Daily Prophet archives that she found the first concrete confirmation of what the photographs had suggested. A brief obituary for Lily Potter, published in the days following her death, mentioned that she had grown up in the mill town of Cokeworth, where she first discovered her magical abilities. "Cokeworth," Hermione murmured, making a note in her careful handwriting. "I've heard that name before, but I can't remember where." Harry could. The memory came to him with uncomfortable clarity. Professor McGonagall, during their first year, making some dismissive comment about students from unfortunate backgrounds like Spinner's End in Cokeworth. At the time, Harry had filed the information away as irrelevant, Now it felt like the key to understanding everything. "Spinner's End," he said aloud, watching Hermione's eyes widen as she made the same connection. That's where Snape lives. Hermione, they weren't just friends. They were neighbors. The implications were staggering. Two magical children growing up in the same dreary industrial town, finding each other across the vast loneliness of being different in a world that didn't understand them. Harry tried to imagine what it must have been like for his mother, discovering that she could make flowers bloom and objects move with nothing but her will, thinking she was alone with this impossible secret. And then finding Severus, who not only shared her abilities, but could explain them, could teach her about the hidden world that would soon become her home. "No wonder they were so close," Hermione said softly, echoing Harry's thoughts. "Can you imagine how isolated they must have felt before they found each other? How much it must have meant to discover that someone else understood." Harry could imagine it, actually. The memory of his own childhood isolation, trapped with the Dursleys, believing himself to be a freak, desperately wishing for someone who might understand his strange experiences, made it all too easy to empathize with two lonely children who had found magic and friendship in each other. But that empathy only made the present situation more confusing. How did the boy who had been kind enough to teach Lily about magic, who had treasured her friendship enough to keep a pressed flower for 20 years, become the man who had made Harry's life miserable from the moment he set foot in potions class? "We need to know what happened between them," Harry said, his voice filled with a determination that surprised him. Something went wrong, obviously. They stopped being friends, and whatever caused it must have been pretty serious. People don't just abandon relationships that important without a good reason. Hermione nodded thoughtfully. "The question is how to find out. I doubt Professor Snape would be willing to discuss his childhood with you, given your history. And I can't think of anyone else who would have known both of them well enough to understand what went wrong." But Harry's mind was already working, following connections and possibilities with an intensity he usually reserved for Quidditch strategies or defense against the dark arts. "What about ghosts?" he asked suddenly. "Nearly headless Nick has been at Hogwarts for centuries. He might have been here when they were students. He might remember something about their friendship, or at least about when it ended." They found Sir Nicholas drifting through the corridors near Gryffindor Tower, engaged in what appeared to be a heated discussion with the Fat Friar about the relative merits of different methods of execution. The Gryffindor ghost seemed genuinely pleased to be interrupted, and even more pleased when Harry asked about his memories of former students. "Ah, Miss Evans," Sir Nicholas said, with the dreamy fondness that seemed to characterize all ghostly recollections. "A delightful girl, truly delightful. Such a bright spirit, always eager to learn about the magical world. I remember her asking me once whether ghosts retained the emotions they had felt in life, or if death changed the essential nature of feeling itself." Quite a philosophical question for a second-year student. "Do you remember her having any particular friends?" Hermione asked carefully. "Anyone she spent a lot of time with, especially from other houses?" The ghost's expression grew thoughtful, his slightly transparent features creasing with the effort of recollection. "There was a young man from Slytherin, I believe. They were often seen together in the earlier years, studying in the library, walking by the lake, engaged in what appeared to be quite intense conversations about magical theory. Most unusual, really, for a Gryffindor and Slytherin to maintain such a close friendship." Harry's heart began beating faster. "Do you remember his name?" "Severus something," Sir Nicholas replied vaguely. "A rather serious boy, as I recall. Quite brilliant, but there was always something melancholy about him. The kind of sadness that comes from difficult circumstances at home, I suspect. Miss Evans seemed to bring out a lighter side of his personality. I recall seeing them laugh together on several occasions." "What happened to their friendship?" Harry pressed. "Did you notice when they stopped spending time together?" The ghost's expression grew darker, and for a moment Harry was reminded that Sir Nicholas had died violently, that his cheerful demeanour concealed centuries of accumulated sorrow. "There was an incident," he said slowly. "5th year, I believe. Some sort of public humiliation involving the young man from Slytherin. I didn't witness it personally, but the after-effects were significant. Miss Evans was quite distressed about something, and after that, I rarely saw them together." Harry exchanged a meaningful look with Hermione. A public humiliation in 5th year. That would match the timeline of the memories they had seen in Snape's pensive 2 years earlier, when Harry had witnessed his father and Sirius tormenting Snape by the lake. The memory that Snape had been so desperate to hide, the one that had shown a young Severus hanging upside down while James Potter entertained a crowd of onlookers. "Did you ever see them reconcile?" Hermione asked gently. Sir Nicholas shook his nearly severed head sadly. "No, I'm afraid not. Whatever happened between them seemed to create a permanent rift. Miss Evans finished her education, graduated with honours, and married James Potter. The young man from Slytherin became increasingly withdrawn, spending more and more time with the darker elements of his house. A tragedy, really. They had been such good friends." As they walked away from their conversation with the ghost, Harry found himself consumed by a growing sense of understanding and horror. The incident Sir Nicholas had described was almost certainly the day Snape had called Lily a mudblood, the worst memory Snape possessed, according to what Harry had seen in the pensive. But now Harry understood that it hadn't just been an isolated moment of cruelty. It had been the destruction of a friendship that had shaped both of their lives. "He lost her because he was humiliated," Harry said quietly, the pieces falling into place with sickening clarity. "Your father and Sirius hung him upside down in front of half the school, and when she tried to defend him, he was so angry and embarrassed that he lashed out at the one person who had always stood by him." Hermione nodded grimly. "And once he said that word, once he called her that, there was no taking it back. No matter how much he regretted it, no matter how much he loved her, she couldn't forgive him for betraying everything their friendship had represented." The next few weeks passed in a haze of hyper-awareness for Harry. Every potions lesson became an exercise in careful observation, as he found himself studying Professor Snape with new eyes, looking for traces of the boy who had sat on playground swings and taught a lonely girl about magic. It was during a particularly challenging lesson on Veritaserum that Harry noticed it, a momentary hesitation, as Snape handled a vial of lily pollen, one of the potion's more delicate ingredients. For just an instant, the professor's usual brisk efficiency faltered, and something almost like tenderness flickered across his features as he added the golden dust to the simmering cauldron. Lily pollen. The ingredient shared a name with Harry's mother, and for one heart-stopping moment, Harry wondered if Snape was thinking the same thing. Did every lesson involving flowers remind him of the girl who had once given him a pressed lily to keep? Did every mention of Gryffindor courage make him think of the friend whose bravery had ultimately cost her life? Harry began to pay attention to these small moments of revelation, the way Snape's expression softened almost imperceptibly when discussing the protective properties of certain plants, the subtle pause that preceded any mention of love potions and their limitations, the careful way he handled ingredients that might have featured in the magical education of a curious young witch. "You're staring," Hermione whispered during one particularly intense observation session. "He's going to notice if you keep watching him like that." But Harry couldn't help himself. Now that he knew what to look for, the signs of Snape's carefully concealed grief were everywhere. The way his voice caught slightly when discussing the theoretical applications of blood-based protection magic, the extra attention he paid to students who reminded him of Lily, not just Harry, but other Muggle-born witches who asked thoughtful questions and challenged established assumptions. It was Hermione who found the old Hogwarts yearbook, buried in the restricted section behind a collection of texts on advanced magical theory. The book dated from Lily and Snape's 7th year, and it contained a treasure trove of information about their final year at school. "Look," she said, pointing to a group photograph of the Potions Club. There, in the back row, stood a teenage Severus Snape, his dark robes impeccable, his expression serious, but not yet hardened into the bitter mask Harry knew so well. And there, in the front row with the other top students, sat Lily Evans, her red hair bright against her Gryffindor robes, her smile warm and genuine. They were in the same frame, but they might as well have been in different worlds. The easy intimacy of the childhood photographs was completely absent, replaced by a careful distance that spoke of unhealed wounds and irreparable damage. "They're not even looking at each other," Harry observed, his voice thick with something he couldn't quite name. "Look at their positioning. It's like they're deliberately avoiding any possibility of eye contact." "The break between them must have been absolute," Hermione agreed. "After 5 years of friendship, to end up like this. Harry, whatever happened between them that day by the lake, it destroyed something that could never be rebuilt." Harry stared at the photograph until the faces blurred together, imagining the weight of regret that both teenagers must have carried. Snape, knowing he had thrown away the most important relationship in his life in a moment of humiliated rage. Lily, forced to choose between her principles and her affection for someone who had betrayed everything she believed in. That night, alone in his dormitory while his roommates slept, Harry wrote a letter to Remus Lupin. The words came slowly, carefully, as he tried to frame questions that might yield answers without revealing too much about what he had discovered. "Dear Professor Lupin," he began, then stopped, crumpling the parchment and starting again. "Dear Remus, I hope this letter finds you well. I've been thinking lately about my parents' time at Hogwarts, and I was wondering if you could tell me more about my mother's friendships during school. Did she have any close friends outside of Gryffindor? I know she and my father didn't get along at first, so I'm curious about who she spent time with before they became friends. I found some old photographs recently, and I'm trying to understand more about the person she was before I was born. Any information you could share would mean a lot to me. Thank you for everything you've done for me over the years. Harry." He read the letter 3 times, weighing each word carefully. It was honest without being specific, curious without being demanding. But as his quill hovered over the parchment, ready to sign his name, Harry found himself hesitating. Did he really want to know the official version of events? Did he want to hear how the adults in his life had decided to frame his mother's friendship with Severus Snape? Or would their careful explanations and diplomatic evasions only obscure the raw truth he had discovered in those hidden photographs? In the end, Harry set the letter aside, unsigned. Whatever answers he was seeking, they wouldn't come from the people who had spent 16 years protecting him from uncomfortable realities. They would have to come from the source, from Professor Snape himself, if Harry could find the courage to ask. As he lay in his bed, staring up at the ceiling of the dormitory, Harry found himself thinking about the pressed lily hidden in his trunk, about the careful way someone had preserved the evidence of a friendship that had meant everything to 2 lonely children. He thought about the weight of carrying love for 20 years, about the kind of devotion that could survive betrayal, loss, and the accumulated bitterness of a life lived in service to someone else's memory. For the first time since discovering the photographs, Harry allowed himself to consider the possibility that Professor Snape's treatment of him might not be rooted in simple hatred. Perhaps it was something far more complex: grief, guilt, and the unbearable reminder of everything Snape had lost when he chose the wrong side of a war that had claimed the only person who had ever truly understood him. The thought should have been comforting, but instead it filled Harry with a strange, aching sadness. Because if Snape's cruelty came from love rather than hatred, if every cutting remark and unfair detention was really an expression of unresolved grief, then the situation was infinitely more tragic than Harry had ever imagined, and infinitely more difficult to resolve. Outside his window, snow continued to fall over the grounds of Hogwarts, covering the familiar landscape in a blanket of white that made everything look clean and new. But Harry knew that beneath the surface, the old patterns remained. The same corridors, the same conflicts, the same tangled web of relationships that had been set in motion decades before he was born. Tomorrow, he would have to face Professor Snape in potions class, armed with knowledge that changed everything, and the terrible understanding that some wounds might be too deep to heal, some words too damaging to take back, some love too complicated to express in anything other than the careful preservation of pressed flowers and faded photographs. The box in his trunk seemed to pulse with the weight of its secrets, and Harry closed his eyes, wondering if he had the courage to discover what else those secrets might reveal. Chapter 3. The First Confrontation. The detention slip appeared on Harry's desk during Transfiguration, with the kind of theatrical timing that suggested Professor Snape had been waiting for exactly the right moment to deliver it. The parchment materialized between Harry's notes on human-to-animal transformations, its presence announced by the faint scent of potions ingredients and something darker, something that always seemed to cling to anything that had spent time in the dungeons. Potter, the slip read in Snape's distinctive angular handwriting. Detention tonight at 8 o'clock. My office. You will be organizing my private ingredient stores. Do not be late. Harry stared at the message, his heart beginning to race with a mixture of dread and anticipation. For 3 weeks, he had been trying to work up the courage to approach Snape directly about the photographs hidden in his trunk. For 3 weeks, he had rehearsed conversations that never seemed to find the right moment, practiced explanations that never felt adequate to the weight of what he had discovered. Now, it seemed, the decision had been taken out of his hands. "What did you do this time?" Ron asked, peering over Harry's shoulder at the detention slip. "I didn't notice you doing anything particularly awful in potions yesterday." Harry hadn't done anything awful in potions yesterday, or in any class recently for that matter. His behavior had been exemplary, almost unnaturally so, as he found himself studying Snape with the kind of careful attention usually reserved for potentially dangerous magical creatures. The detention was clearly pretense, an excuse to get Harry alone, though whether for punishment or something else entirely remained to be seen. "I'll probably survive," Harry said, tucking the slip into his bag with hands that trembled slightly. "It's just organizing ingredients. How bad could it be?" But even as he spoke the words, Harry knew this detention would be unlike any other. He had made his decision somewhere between Transfiguration and lunch, settling into a determination that felt both terrifying and inevitable. Tonight, he would bring the photograph. Tonight, he would finally ask the questions that had been consuming him since Christmas break. Tonight, he would discover whether Professor Severus Snape was capable of speaking honestly about the girl who had once called him her best friend. The dungeons felt different at 8 o'clock in the evening, when most of the castle's occupants were settled comfortably in their common rooms or finishing homework by the warmth of their fireplaces. The corridors seemed to stretch longer in the lamplight, the shadows deeper and more full of possibility. Harry's footsteps echoed against the stone floors with a rhythm that seemed to match his increasingly rapid heartbeat. Snape's office lay behind the potions classroom, accessed through a heavy wooden door that Harry had passed countless times but never entered. When he knocked, 3 sharp raps that sounded unnaturally loud in the corridor's silence, the response came immediately, as if Snape had been waiting just on the other side. "Enter." The room beyond was nothing like Harry had expected, and everything he should have anticipated from someone as complex and contradictory as Severus Snape. It was larger than Harry had imagined, with high ceilings that disappeared into shadow and walls lined with shelves containing what appeared to be the most comprehensive private collection of potions ingredients in Britain. Glass jars filled with preserved specimens caught the light from oil lamps positioned throughout the room, creating an atmosphere that was equal parts laboratory and library. Rare herbs hung in bundles from the ceiling, their dried leaves rustling softly in the barely perceptible air currents. A large desk dominated one corner of the space, its surface covered with essays, potion formulas, and what appeared to be several works in progress. And everywhere the scent of magic, not the warm, homey magic of the burrow, or the ancient, settled magic of Hogwarts itself, but something sharper, more focused. The magic of someone who had spent decades bending the natural world to his will through careful study and precise application of knowledge. Snape himself stood with his back to the door, apparently absorbed in the examination of a particular jar containing what looked like pickled slugs. He was dressed in his usual black robes, but in the intimate setting of his private office they seemed less like a costume and more like armor, protection against the world's intrusions into his carefully constructed solitude. "You're 3 minutes late, Potter," he said without turning around. "An inauspicious beginning to what I had hoped would be a productive evening." "Sorry, Professor," Harry replied, though his voice sounded strange to his own ears. The formal exchange felt surreal when weighted against the conversation he was planning to initiate. "Where would you like me to start?" "The ingredient store's in the far corner," Snape said, finally turning to face Harry with the kind of expression that had intimidated first-year students for decades. "They have become disorganized over the course of the term. You will sort them alphabetically, check the expiration dates on any time-sensitive components, and create an inventory list for my review." It was busy work, clearly, but Harry approached the task with unusual focus, using the familiar routine of organizing and cataloguing to steady his nerves. The photograph seemed to burn against his chest where he had hidden it beneath his robes, and several times he found himself reaching unconsciously toward it before catching himself and returning his attention to the shelves. For nearly an hour, they worked in relative silence. Snape graded essays at his desk, while Harry sorted through jars of beetle eyes, dried nettles, and an impressive variety of substances he couldn't begin to identify. The only sounds were the scratching of Snape's quill, the soft clink of glass containers being rearranged, and the occasional hiss of a potion that continued to brew somewhere in the room's darker corners. It was the sight of a particular jar that finally gave Harry the courage he needed. Lily pollen, according to the neat label, harvested from the rare, magical variety that bloomed only in protected gardens. The golden dust seemed to glow in the lamplight, and Harry found himself remembering the way Snape had hesitated when handling the same ingredient during their recent Veritaserum lesson. "Professor," he said, his voice cutting through the silence with surprising steadiness, "I found something over Christmas break. Something I think you should see." Snape's quill stopped moving across the parchment, though he didn't immediately look up from his grading. "Indeed. How fascinating for you, Potter. I trust it was more intellectually stimulating than your usual holiday pursuits." Harry reached beneath his robes and withdrew the photograph, holding it carefully by its edges. The image seemed even more impossible here, in this place of shadows and sharp edges, than it had in the dusty comfort of Regulus's abandoned bedroom. Two children on playground swings, their faces bright with uncomplicated happiness, seemed to belong to an entirely different universe than this dungeon office where Harry faced the man one of those children had become. "I think this belongs to you," Harry said, extending the photograph toward Snape's desk. The effect was immediate and devastating. Snape's head jerked up, his black eyes focusing on the image in Harry's hand, and for one incredible moment, every mask he had ever worn simply fell away. His face went ashen, then pale grey, then something approaching the colour of old parchment. His hand, still holding the quill, began to shake visibly. "Where did you get this?" The words came out as barely more than a whisper, but they carried the force of a shout. Snape was on his feet before Harry could blink, moving around the desk with the predatory grace that had always made him seem more dangerous than his colleagues. "I found it," Harry said, holding his ground, though every instinct screamed at him to step backward. "Hidden in Grimmauld Place, in a collection that probably belonged to Regulus Black." Snape reached for the photograph, his movements sharp and desperate, But Harry pulled it back slightly, not enough to seem deliberately withholding, but enough to maintain control of the conversation he had initiated. "She was your friend," Harry said, making it a statement rather than a question. "Before Hogwarts, before everything went wrong. My mother was your friend." For a long moment, Snape simply stared at him, his expression cycling through surprise, anger, pain, and something that might have been relief. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. "Your mother was extraordinary, even as a child." The admission seemed to cost him something vital. He sank back into his chair, as if the weight of those words had physically exhausted him, his usual perfect posture crumbling into something that looked almost human. "How long were you friends?" Harry pressed, sensing that this moment of vulnerability might be his only opportunity to get real answers. "Yes," Snape said quietly, his eyes fixed on the photograph in Harry's hands. "From the time we were 9 until—" He stopped, his jaw clenching, as if the rest of the sentence was too painful to speak aloud. "Until what? What happened between you?" Snape's laugh was bitter, devoid of any humor. What always happens between children who are foolish enough to believe that friendship can transcend the boundaries the world insists on drawing. "I made choices, Potter. Choices that cannot be undone. I spoke words that destroyed everything." Harry thought of the memories he had seen in Snape's pensive 2 years earlier. The humiliation by the lake, the crowd of onlookers, the moment when everything had gone wrong. "You called her a mudblood." The word seemed to physically strike Snape. He flinched, as if Harry had hit him, his hands clenching into fists on the surface of his desk. "Yes," he said finally. "I called her that. In a moment of anger and humiliation, I threw away the most important relationship in my life for the sake of preserving my wounded pride." "But you tried to apologize," Harry said, remembering Lily's letters, the way they spoke of complicated feelings and difficult choices. "She wrote about forgiving people, about understanding that everyone makes mistakes." "Some mistakes are unforgivable," Snape replied, his voice gaining strength as he fell back into the familiar rhythms of his classroom persona. "Some words, once spoken, change everything. Your mother understood that. She understood that I had aligned myself with people who wanted to destroy everything she represented." Harry studied Snape's face, noting the careful way he avoided making eye contact, the rigid set of his shoulders that suggested he was fighting to maintain control. "You've been looking for this photograph for a long time, haven't you?" Snape's eyes snapped to his, and Harry saw a flash of something raw and desperate. "It was stolen during my first year at Hogwarts," he said quietly, "taken from my trunk by someone who thought it would be amusing to remind me of former loyalties. I have spent 20 years wondering what became of it. And now you know," Harry said, extending the photograph again. This time Snape took it with hands that trembled slightly, holding it as if it were made of the most fragile glass. For several minutes, the office was silent, except for the soft bubbling of various potions and the distant sound of wind through the castle's corridors. Snape stared at the image with an expression of such profound sadness that Harry found himself looking away, feeling like an intruder on a moment of private grief. "She saw the good in everyone," Snape said finally, his voice so quiet Harry had to strain to hear it. "Even in me, especially in me. She believed that people could change, that the choices we make as children don't have to define us forever." "But you didn't believe that," Harry said, understanding beginning to crystallize in his mind. "I proved her wrong," Snape replied bitterly. "I became exactly what everyone expected me to become. I joined the Death Eaters, I served the Dark Lord, I helped bring about the very war that killed her." The confession hung between them like a living thing, too large and terrible to be contained by the walls of the office. Harry found himself struggling to process the implications, not just of Snape's past allegiances, which he had suspected for years, but of the guilt and self-loathing that had clearly shaped every day of the man's life since Lily's death. "You have her eyes," Snape said suddenly, looking up from the photograph to meet Harry's gaze directly. "They're exactly the same color, the same shape. But you don't see what she saw, do you, Potter? You don't see the possibility of redemption in everyone around you." "Maybe because I've learned that not everyone deserves it," Harry replied, then immediately regretted the harshness of his words. But Snape simply nodded, as if Harry had confirmed something he had long suspected. "Indeed. You are perhaps wiser than she was in that regard." Harry wanted to argue, wanted to defend his mother's memory against the suggestion that her compassion had been a weakness. But something in Snape's expression stopped him, a look of such profound regret and loss that it made Harry's chest ache with sympathetic pain. "Do you—" Harry began, then stopped, unsure how to frame the question that had been burning in his mind for weeks. "Do you still think about her? About what might have happened if things had been different?" Snape's smile was one of the saddest things Harry had ever seen. "Every day, Potter. Every single day for 20 years. The admission was so raw, so completely devoid of the defensive sarcasm that usually characterized Snape's conversations, that Harry felt tears prick at the corners of his eyes. This wasn't the cold, bitter professor who had made his life miserable for 6 years. This was a man who had loved someone completely and had spent decades living with the consequences of his own failure to be worthy of that love. "She would have forgiven you eventually," Harry said quietly, though he wasn't entirely sure he believed it. "If you had found a way to prove that you had changed, that you were sorry for what you said." "Perhaps," Snape agreed, though his tone suggested he found the possibility unlikely. "But forgiveness was never the point, Potter. The point was that I had already chosen a path that led away from everything she represented. The word I spoke that day was not an aberration. It was the logical conclusion of months of compromise, of allowing myself to be influenced by those who shared neither her values nor her vision of what the wizarding world could become." Harry thought about the Death Eater children Snape would have been surrounded by in Slytherin House, about the pressure to conform that he himself had felt during his brief experience with the Sorting Hat's consideration of placing him there. But Snape seemed to read his thoughts, shaking his head with bitter certainty. "Do not make excuses for me," he said sharply. "I made my choices freely, with full knowledge of their consequences. Your mother tried to warn me, tried to help me see what I was becoming. I chose not to listen." "But you changed eventually," Harry pressed. "You're not a Death Eater anymore. You're here, at Hogwarts, protecting students like the one she would have been." Snape's expression hardened, the momentary vulnerability disappearing behind the familiar mask of cold control. "What I am now is irrelevant to what I was then. Redemption is a luxury afforded to those who deserve it, Potter. I forfeited that right the moment I joined the Dark Lord." "My mother wouldn't agree with that," Harry said with sudden conviction. "She believed people could change. You said so yourself." "Your mother is dead," Snape replied flatly, and the words hit Harry like a physical blow. "Killed by the very evil I helped to empower. Her faith in human nature died with her." The office fell silent again, but this time the quiet felt heavy with unspoken truths and unexpressed grief. Harry found himself staring at the photograph in Snape's hands, at the image of 2 children who had believed the world was full of possibilities, who had trusted in friendship and magic, and the idea that understanding could bridge any divide. "Keep it," Harry said finally, nodding toward the photograph. "It belongs to you more than anyone else." Snape looked up sharply, as if he couldn't quite believe what he had heard. "Potter, she gave you that friendship," Harry continued, surprising himself with the steadiness of his voice. "She chose to see something good in you when no one else would. That has to count for something, doesn't it? Even if everything went wrong afterward, even if you made mistakes that can't be undone, that friendship was real. She cared about you." For a moment, Snape's carefully constructed composure cracked completely. His shoulders shook slightly, And when he spoke, his voice was thick with emotion Harry had never heard from him before. "She deserved better than what this world gave her," he whispered, the words barely audible above the soft sounds of the potions brewing around them. She deserved to live, to raise her son, to see the kind of man he would become. She deserved to forgive or not forgive as she chose, not to have that choice taken from her by someone else's war. Harry felt tears in his eyes again, but this time he didn't try to hide them. "She chose to protect me," he said quietly. "Whatever mistakes you made, whatever words were spoken, in the end, she chose love. And maybe that choice was influenced by the friendship you gave her when she was young. Maybe you taught her something about loyalty, about caring for people even when it's difficult." Snape stared at him for a long moment, as if trying to decide whether Harry's words were genuine comfort or cruel mockery. Finally, he carefully placed the photograph on his desk, smoothing it with gentle fingers. "You may go, Potter," he said, his voice returning to its usual controlled tone, though some of the earlier warmth remained. "Your detention is complete." Harry moved toward the door, then stopped, turning back to face the man who had just revealed more of himself than Harry had ever imagined possible. "Professor," he said carefully, "some truths are more painful than ignorance, but they're still truths, and sometimes knowing them changes things for the better." Snape looked up from the photograph, his expression unreadable. "Indeed, Potter. Though I suspect you will find that knowledge of this particular truth brings more questions than answers." As Harry left the office, closing the heavy door behind him with a soft click, he found himself thinking about the weight of carrying love for someone who was gone, about the kind of devotion that could survive 20 years of guilt and regret. He thought about the boy in the photograph, whose happiness had been so genuine and uncomplicated, and about the man who had just trusted him with the most painful chapter of his life. The dungeons seemed different as he made his way back to Gryffindor Tower, not less dark, but somehow less threatening. The shadows held possibilities now, rather than just dangers, and Harry found himself wondering what other truths might be hidden in the spaces between what he thought he knew and what actually was. In his pocket, he carried the memory of Snape's whispered confession, the image of a man who had spent 20 years living with the consequences of choices made in youth and anger. And for the first time since discovering the photograph, Harry began to understand that the line between love and loss, between redemption and regret, might be far more complicated than he had ever imagined. Behind him, in the shadows of the dungeon office, Severus Snape sat alone with a photograph of 2 children who had once believed that friendship could conquer anything, their faces bright with the kind of hope that only exists before the world teaches you how fragile happiness can be. Chapter 4. Memories in the Pensieve. 3 days passed before the second summons came, 3 days during which Harry found himself unable to concentrate on anything resembling normal academic pursuits. Every potions lesson became an exercise in careful observation, as he watched Professor Snape for signs of... what exactly? Regret about their conversation? Plans for revenge? Some indication of how their unprecedented moment of honesty had affected the careful balance of animosity that had defined their relationship for 6 years? But Snape gave nothing away. If anything, he seemed more controlled than usual, his movements precise to the point of being mechanical, his voice devoid of even its customary sarcasm. He graded essays with ruthless efficiency, assigned detentions for minor infractions, and maintained the kind of professional distance that might have convinced a casual observer that nothing had changed. Harry knew better. He had seen the way Snape's hands had trembled when he held the photograph, had heard the raw pain in his voice when he spoke of choices that could not be undone. That level of vulnerability couldn't simply be erased by 3 days of determined composure. So when the second detention slip appeared on Harry's desk during lunch, This time, without even the pretense of academic infractions to justify it, Harry felt a mixture of anticipation and dread that made it impossible to finish his sandwich. "Another detention?" Hermione asked, reading the parchment over his shoulder. "Harry, what's going on? You haven't done anything to warrant this level of attention from Professor Snape." "Maybe he's finally lost it completely," Ron suggested, through a mouthful of treacle tart. "Maybe he's decided to just torture you for the fun of it, whether you've done anything wrong or not." Harry folded the detention slip carefully and tucked it into his robes, next to the space where the photograph had rested for so many weeks. "I'll be fine," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "It's just Snape being Snape." But as he made his way to the dungeons that evening, Harry suspected that what awaited him would be anything but routine. The previous conversation had opened something between them, a door that had been sealed for 20 years, and Harry doubted that Snape was the kind of man to leave such things unfinished. The potions classroom was empty when Harry arrived, its tables cleared of the usual debris of academic instruction. The air still carried the faint scent of recently brewed potions, but underneath it was something else, something that reminded Harry of the hospital wing after a particularly difficult healing, antiseptic and careful and somehow sorrowful. Snape's office door stood open, revealing a space that had been transformed since Harry's last visit. The usual clutter of essays and potion supplies had been cleared away, leaving only the essential furniture, and, positioned prominently on the central desk, a shallow stone basin that Harry recognized with a jolt of surprise and apprehension. A pensieve. Not the elaborate, ornate basin that Dumbledore used, but something simpler, older, worn smooth by decades of use. The silver substance within it swirled with lazy, hypnotic movements, occasionally forming shapes that might have been faces or landscapes before dissolving back into abstraction. Snape stood beside the desk with his back to the door, his posture suggesting that he had been standing there for some time, gathering the courage, or perhaps the determination, to proceed with whatever he had planned. "Close the door, Potter," he said, without turning around, "and cast a locking charm. What I am about to show you is not for casual observation." Harry complied, his hands moving automatically through the familiar motions while his mind raced with possibilities. A pensieve meant memories, personal memories, given the private setting and Snape's obvious reluctance. But why? What could Snape possibly gain by sharing his recollections with the son of the woman who had rejected him? "Professor," Harry began, but Snape cut him off with a sharp gesture. "If you must know the truth about your mother and me," Snape said, his voice carefully controlled, but carrying an undercurrent of something that might have been resignation, "then you will see it properly. Not through second-hand accounts or speculation, but through the memories themselves." He finally turned to face Harry, his expression unreadable, but his eyes holding a depth of pain that made Harry's chest tighten with sympathy. "I have selected 4 memories that should illuminate the nature of our relationship. You will observe them without comment, without question, and without judgment. Is that understood?" Harry nodded, not trusting his voice to remain steady. The magnitude of what Snape was offering, the trust inherent in sharing one's most private memories, was almost overwhelming. This was unprecedented, not just in their relationship, but in everything Harry understood about the man's character. "The first memory," Snape continued, moving to stand beside the pensieve, "is from the summer of 1969. Your mother was 9 years old, and I was watching her." The word "watching" carried implications that might have been disturbing in any other context, but something in Snape's tone suggested a different kind of observation, the careful attention of one lonely child recognizing something remarkable in another. Snape withdrew his wand and touched it to his temple, drawing forth a silvery strand that he deposited into the basin with reverent care. The memory swirled and settled, forming images that beckoned with the promise of revelation. "Together," Snape said simply, gesturing toward the pensieve. The sensation of entering a memory was always disorienting, but this time Harry felt an additional layer of strangeness, the intimacy of experiencing someone else's most private recollections, of seeing the world through eyes that had loved his mother with a depth and constancy that Harry was only beginning to understand. The world reformed around them in the soft, golden light of a summer evening. They stood in a small playground, its equipment worn but well-maintained, surrounded by the kind of modest houses that suggested a working-class neighborhood where children played in the streets and parents called them in for tea when the sun began to set. And there, on a swing that creaked softly in the evening breeze, sat a little girl with the brightest red hair Harry had ever seen. Even at 9 years old, Lily Evans was unmistakably his mother. She had the same warm green eyes, the same generous smile, the same way of tilting her head when she was concentrating on something particularly interesting. But there was something else, something that the photographs hadn't captured, a sense of barely contained magic that seemed to shimmer in the air around her like heat waves rising from summer pavement. As Harry watched, transfixed, Lily extended her hand toward a patch of wilted daisies growing beside the swing set. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, the flowers began to straighten, their petals brightening from brown to white to the most perfect cream color Harry had ever seen. Lily laughed with pure delight, clapping her hands as the magic responded to her will. "She's making them beautiful," whispered a voice from behind a nearby tree, and Harry turned to see 9-year-old Severus Snape emerge from his hiding place. The boy was thin to the point of being scrawny, his dark hair hanging in his eyes, his clothes showing the kind of careful mending that spoke of poverty rather than neglect. But his expression as he watched Lily work magic was one of such awe and admiration that Harry felt his throat constrict with emotion. Young Severus approached the swing set with the careful movements of a child who had learned not to startle easily frightened creatures. "You're a witch," he said, his voice filled with wonder rather than accusation. Lily spun around, her eyes wide with alarm. "I don't know what you're talking about. I was just—" "The flowers were dying, and I thought if I wished hard enough—" "It's all right," Severus said quickly, holding up his hands in a gesture of peace. "I'm one too. A wizard, I mean. Look." He picked up a fallen leaf and held it in his palm, concentrating with the intense focus that only children could achieve. Slowly, the leaf began to change colors, cycling through the entire spectrum of autumn, before settling on a brilliant gold that seemed to glow in the evening light. Lily's fear transformed instantly into fascination. "How did you do that? Can you teach me?" The smile that crossed young Severus's face was so genuine, so completely free of the bitterness and pain that would later define him, that Harry found himself blinking back tears. This was what Severus Snape looked like when he was truly happy, young and eager and desperate to share his knowledge with someone who understood. "There's a whole world," Severus said, settling onto the swing beside Lily, with the careful deliberation of a child making a momentous decision. "A whole world of people like us. Magic is real, and we're part of it." The memory began to fade, the golden light of evening dissolving into silver mist. But not before Harry caught sight of Lily's expression, bright with wonder and gratitude, and the beginning of what would clearly become a deep, transformative friendship. They surfaced from the pensive into the lamplight of Snape's office, and Harry found himself gasping as if he had been underwater. The emotion in that memory, the pure, uncomplicated joy of two children discovering they weren't alone in their strangeness, was almost overwhelming. "She was extraordinary," Snape said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of 20 years of remembrance. "Even then, even as a child, she possessed a natural grace with magic that I have rarely seen equaled." Harry nodded, not trusting his voice. He had seen his mother perform magic before, in other people's memories, but never like this. Never with the unfettered delight of a child who had just discovered that the impossible was not only possible but within her reach. "The second memory," Snape continued, withdrawing another silvery strand from his temple, is from our first day at Hogwarts, September 1st, 1971. This memory was more chaotic than the first, filled with the noise and confusion of King's Cross Station and the excitement of hundreds of children embarking on what might be the greatest adventure of their lives. Harry found himself standing on the platform beside the Scarlet Hogwarts Express, watching as 11-year-old Lily and Severus approached the train together. They had changed in the 2 years since the playground memory. Lily had grown taller, her red hair longer and more carefully braided, her simple dress replaced by the kind of clothing that suggested her parents had splurged on school clothes for their magical daughter. Severus had changed as well, though in ways that were more subtle. His clothes were still obviously second-hand, but they were cleaner, better fitted. More importantly, his posture had changed. Walking beside Lily, he carried himself with a confidence that Harry had never seen in the adult version. "Do you think we'll be in the same house?" Lily was asking as they searched for an empty compartment. "I've read all about them in Hogwarts, a history, but I still don't quite understand how the sorting works." "We'll find out soon enough," Severus replied, though Harry caught the note of anxiety in his young voice. "The important thing is that we're both here, together." They found seats in a compartment that also contained a nervous-looking boy with round glasses and a girl with elaborate blonde ringlets who was clearly from a wealthy pure-blood family. The conversation that followed was stilted, formal, full of the careful politeness of children trying to make good impressions. But Harry's attention was focused on Lily and Severus, on the way they sat close enough that their shoulders touched, on the silent communication that passed between them when the other children made comments about blood status or family history. They were a unit, Harry realized. Whatever differences existed between their backgrounds, whatever challenges they might face at Hogwarts, they faced them together. The memory shifted forward, compressing hours into moments, until they were standing in the great hall, beneath the enchanted ceiling, waiting to be sorted. Harry watched his mother's face as she took in the grandeur of her new school, the wonder and determination that flickered across her features as she prepared to embrace whatever house chose her. And then McGonagall was calling, "Evans, Lily," and she was walking toward the sorting hat, with her head held high, her red hair catching the candlelight like fire. The hat was barely settled on her head before it called out, "Gryffindor!" And Lily was walking toward the red and gold table with a smile that could have lit the entire castle. Harry turned to watch Severus's reaction, and what he saw made his heart break a little. The boy's face had gone ashen, his carefully maintained composure cracking to reveal the fear beneath. Because Severus knew, as Harry knew, as everyone in the wizarding world knew, that Gryffindors and Slytherins were not meant to be friends, that whatever house claimed Severus would determine whether their friendship could survive the prejudices of centuries. "Snape! Severus!" McGonagall called, and the thin, dark-haired boy walked forward with the measured steps of someone walking to his execution. The sorting hat deliberated longer this time, long enough for whispers to begin among the watching students. Finally, inevitably, it called out, "Slytherin," and Severus walked toward the green and silver table, while Lily watched from across the great hall with an expression of confused disappointment. The memory faded, but not before Harry caught sight of young Severus at the Slytherin table, sitting alone among his new housemates, while his eyes remained fixed on the red-headed girl who had just been claimed by his traditional enemies. "The third memory," Snape said, his voice even quieter now, "is from our second year. A difficult period." The scene that emerged from the pensieve was darker, both literally and figuratively. They stood in a shadowy corridor in the dungeons, where teenage Lily faced off against 3 older Slytherin students who had clearly cornered young Severus for reasons that had nothing to do with academic pursuits. "Snivelus," one of them was saying, the nickname dripping with contempt. "Still hanging around with mudbloods, I see. Haven't your housemates taught you better by now?" Severus was pressed against the wall, his face pale, but his eyes defiant. He was clearly outnumbered and outmatched, but he showed no intention of backing down or apologizing for his friendship with Lily. "Leave him alone," Lily said, her voice ringing with authority despite her youth. She had positioned herself directly between Severus and his tormentors, her wand drawn, and her posture suggesting she knew how to use it. 3 against 1. Very brave of you. "This doesn't concern you, Evans," another Slytherin sneered. "This is house business." "Severus is my friend," Lily replied, her voice gaining strength with each word. "That makes it my business." What followed was not a duel so much as a demonstration. Lily's magic crackled with righteous anger, and within moments the 3 older students found themselves on the wrong end of a series of hexes that left them sporting boils, temporary baldness, and what appeared to be an unfortunate case of uncontrollable hiccuping. As they fled, dignity in tatters, Lily turned to Severus with concern, written clearly across her features. "Are you all right? Did they hurt you?" "I'm fine," Severus said, though his voice was thick with emotion. "Thank you. You didn't have to." "Yes, I did," Lily interrupted firmly. "That's what friends do. They stand up for each other." She reached into her bag and withdrew something small, a white flower that she had evidently picked from the grounds. "Here," she said, pressing it into Severus's hand, "to remember that not everyone sees the world the way they do." Young Severus stared at the flower as if it were the most precious thing in existence. "Lily," he said quietly, "I need you to know. Whatever happens, whatever anyone says about me or about the choices I make, this friendship means everything to me." The memory began to dissolve, but Harry caught one final image: Severus carefully tucking the white flower into his textbook, preserving it with the kind of reverence usually reserved for sacred relics. "The pressed lily," Harry whispered as they surfaced from the pensive. "The one in the box. She gave it to you when you were 12. Snape nodded, his expression distant. "She defended me, Potter. When my own housemates turned against me for associating with a Muggle-born, she stood between me and them, without hesitation. No one had ever done that before." The 4th memory was the most painful to watch, perhaps because it contained so much joy that Harry knew would inevitably be destroyed. It showed Lily and Severus by the lake during what must have been their 3rd or 4th year, engaged in what appeared to be an informal potions lesson. They sat close together on a fallen log, a collection of plants and flowers spread between them on a cloth that Lily must have brought from the castle. Severus was explaining the properties of each ingredient, his young voice filled with the passionate enthusiasm of someone sharing his greatest talent with his most appreciative audience. "Moonstone powder amplifies any potion's emotional effects," he was saying, holding up a small vial of silvery dust. "But you have to be careful with the dosage. Too much, and the drinker becomes overwhelmed by whatever they're feeling." Lily listened with the intense concentration she brought to all her studies, but there was something else in her expression, a warmth, an affection that went beyond academic interest. "You know so much about this," she said admiringly. "I think you're the cleverest person I know, Sev." Young Severus flushed with pleasure at the compliment, his usual nervous energy settling into something approaching contentment. "My mum taught me some of it before she died," he said quietly. She was brilliant with potions, said it was the most honest kind of magic, because you couldn't fake your way through it. Either you understood the ingredients and their interactions, or you didn't. "She sounds wonderful," Lily said softly, reaching out to touch Severus's arm in a gesture of comfort that was so natural, so unconscious, that Harry felt his throat tighten with emotion. "She was," Severus agreed. "She would have liked you. She always said that the best people were the ones who saw possibilities instead of limitations." They continued their impromptu lesson as the afternoon wore on, Lily asking questions that revealed both her natural intelligence and her genuine interest in Severus's expertise. But what struck Harry most powerfully was the easy intimacy between them, the way they moved in sync, the way they finished each other's thoughts, the way they laughed together at shared jokes and references. This was what love looked like, Harry realized with startling clarity. Not the dramatic passion of fairy tales, but the quiet devotion of two people who truly understood and appreciated each other. Young Severus loved Lily with every fibre of his being, and while her feelings might not have been romantic, her affection for him was deep and genuine. "You're my best friend, Sev," she said, as the sun began to set behind the mountains. "Whatever happens, whatever houses we're in or what other people say, you'll always be my best friend." The promise was made with the fierce certainty that only children possess, but Harry could see the shadows gathering even in this perfect moment. Because he knew, as adult Severus knew, that promises made by children are often beyond their power to keep. When they emerged from the fourth memory, the office seemed almost unbearably quiet. Harry found himself struggling to process what he had seen, not just the friendship between his mother and Snape, but the depth of emotion that had existed between them. The young man in those memories had loved Lily with a purity and constancy that was both beautiful and heartbreaking. "She saw the good in everyone," Snape said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Even in me. Especially in me. She believed that people could change, that the choices we make as children don't have to define us forever." "Did you love her?" The question escaped before Harry could stop it, but once it was spoken, he found he needed to know the answer. Snape was quiet for so long that Harry began to think he wouldn't respond. When he finally spoke, his words carried the weight of 20 years of careful honesty. "I loved her before I understood what love meant," he said quietly. "Before I knew the difference between possession and devotion, between wanting someone and wanting them to be happy. I loved her with all the intensity and ignorance of youth, and when I lost her friendship, I thought my world had ended." "But you still love her now," Harry said, making it a statement rather than a question. Snape's smile was one of the saddest things Harry had ever seen. "I have loved her for 20 years, Potter. I will love her until the day I die. But now I understand that love is not about what you can take from someone. It is about what you can give, what you can protect, what you can honor." Harry felt tears pricking at the corners of his eyes as the full magnitude of Snape's sacrifice became clear. Every cruel word, every unfair detention, every moment of antagonism between them. It all faded into insignificance beside the simple fact that this man had spent 20 years protecting the son of the woman he loved, asking nothing in return except the right to continue grieving. "She would be proud of you," Harry said quietly, surprising himself with the certainty in his voice, "for protecting me, for choosing to honor her memory instead of giving in to bitterness." Snape looked at him sharply, as if trying to determine whether the words were genuine or simply polite platitudes. Whatever he saw in Harry's expression seemed to satisfy him, because some of the tension left his shoulders. "Perhaps," he said finally, "though I suspect she would have preferred that I find a way to protect you without making your life miserable in the process." For the first time since entering the office, Harry almost smiled. "Probably. She seems like she was reasonable about things like that." "She was reasonable about everything," Snape replied, and for just a moment his voice carried an echo of the boyish enthusiasm Harry had witnessed in the memories. "It was one of the things I loved most about her. Her ability to see past the surface of things, to understand the complexities that most people prefer to ignore." The silence that followed was comfortable rather than awkward, filled with the shared understanding of two people who had finally found common ground in their mutual love for the same extraordinary woman. Harry found himself thinking about the weight of carrying such memories, about the kind of strength it must have taken to preserve them through 20 years of loss and regret. "Thank you," he said finally, his voice thick with emotion. for showing me, for helping me understand." Snape inclined his head slightly, accepting the gratitude with the same careful dignity he brought to all his interactions. "You have your mother's eyes, Potter," he said quietly. Perhaps you also have her ability to see past the surface of things." As Harry left the office that night, his mind reeling with everything he had witnessed, he carried with him the image of two children by a lake, sharing knowledge and laughter, and the kind of friendship that should have lasted a lifetime. He thought about love that endured beyond death, beyond betrayal, beyond every reasonable limit, and for the first time in 6 years, when he thought about Professor Severus Snape, Harry felt something other than anger or fear. He felt instead a deep and complicated sympathy for a man who had learned too late that some kinds of love are meant to be given freely, without expectation of return. Chapter 5. Understanding the Child Snape. Was sleep came fitfully to Harry in the days following his journey through Snape's memories, filled with dreams that blended his own experiences with images of a thin, dark-haired boy who had once sat on playground swings and believed that friendship could conquer the cruelties of the world. He would wake in the pre-dawn darkness of his dormitory, his heart racing with emotions that didn't entirely belong to him, his mind struggling to separate what he had witnessed from what he had lived. The memories clung to him like morning mist, impossible to shake, and somehow essential to breathe. During Transfiguration, he found himself staring at his notes without seeing them, his quill frozen above parchment, as he relived the moment when 9-year-old Lily had defended Severus from his tormentors. In defense against the dark arts, Professor Lupin's voice became a distant hum as Harry's mind conjured images of two children by a lake, sharing knowledge and laughter, and the kind of trust that should have lasted a lifetime. It was Hermione who finally intervened, cornering him in the common room on a Thursday evening when his distraction had become too obvious to ignore. "You haven't heard a word anyone said to you in 3 days," she observed, settling into the chair across from him, with the determined expression that usually preceded her most thorough interrogations. "Ron asked you twice if you wanted to play chess, and you just nodded without looking up from a book you've been staring at for an hour without turning a single page." Harry glanced down and realized she was right. The text on defensive magic theory might as well have been written in ancient runes for all the sense it was making to him. His mind was elsewhere, lost in the labyrinth of implications that Snape's memories had created. "I'm fine," he said automatically, though the words felt hollow even to him. "No, you're not." Hermione's voice carried the gentle firmness that had gotten them through 6 years of friendship and crisis. "Harry, what happened in your detention with Professor Snape? You've been different ever since, and not in a way that suggests you organized ingredient stores for 3 hours. For a moment, Harry considered maintaining the fiction that nothing significant had occurred, but the weight of carrying Snape's secrets alone had become nearly unbearable, and Hermione had always been better at processing complex emotional information than either Harry or Ron. "He showed me memories," Harry said finally, his voice barely above a whisper, "about him and my mother, about their childhood." Hermione's eyes widened with surprise and concern. "Memories? Harry, that's incredibly personal. Sharing someone's memories is one of the most intimate forms of trust in the wizarding world." "I know." Harry set his book aside and leaned back in his chair, finally allowing himself to meet Hermione's gaze. "That's what makes this so complicated. I saw who he was before everything went wrong, and Hermione, he was just a child. A lonely, brilliant child who found someone who understood him." What followed was the most difficult conversation Harry had ever initiated, as he struggled to put into words the profound shift in his understanding of Professor Snape. He described the memories in careful detail, watching Hermione's expression cycle through surprise, empathy, and the kind of analytical thoughtfulness that made her such an invaluable friend. "So they were genuinely close," she said, when Harry finished. "Not just neighbors or casual acquaintances, but real friends who cared deeply about each other. More than that, Harry replied, thinking of the way young Severus had looked at Lily, the careful reverence with which he had preserved her gift of a pressed flower. He loved her, Hermione, completely and absolutely, from the time they were children until now, I suppose. Hermione was quiet for a long moment, processing the implications with the same methodical approach she brought to her most challenging academic problems. And you think that changes how we should understand his behavior toward you? I don't know what it changes, Harry admitted, but it explains things. Why he's protected me all these years despite clearly hating me. Why he reacts so strongly when my father is mentioned. Why he looks at me sometimes like I'm causing him physical pain just by existing. Because you look like your father but have your mother's eyes, Hermione said softly, understanding immediately. You must be a constant reminder of everything he lost. Harry nodded, feeling a familiar tightness in his chest at the thought of carrying such unwitting significance in someone else's emotional landscape. It's not just that, though. After seeing those memories, I started thinking about what his childhood must have been like, and Hermione, I think it was terrible. This was the realization that had been growing in Harry's mind like a slow poison, fed by fragments of information he had never bothered to piece together before. Snape's obvious poverty, visible even as a child. His defensive posture around other students, the way he had seemed to expect cruelty from his Slytherin housemates, the hungry way he had absorbed Lily's friendship, as if kindness were a rare and precious commodity in his life. I've been researching, Harry continued, lowering his voice further as other students moved through the common room around them. Not obviously just looking up things about Spinner's End, about the area where they grew up. Hermione, it's awful. Industrial, depressing, the kind of place where magical children would have no one to turn to except each other. Hermione leaned forward, her academic curiosity clearly engaged. What did you find? Spinner's End is in Cokeworth, which was a mill town that basically died when the textile industry collapsed in the 60s. High unemployment, poverty, social problems. And I remembered something. Second year, when we took Polyjuice Potion to sneak into Slytherin House. Crabbe and Goyle were talking about how some students came from unfortunate backgrounds and shouldn't be sorted into their house. I think they might have been talking about Snape. The picture Harry was painting grew darker as he continued his research, consulting old newspapers and census records that painted Cokeworth as a place where hope went to die. He found references to Tobias Snape, Severus's father, in police records dating back to the late 60s and early 70s. Drunk and disorderly conduct, domestic disturbance calls, the kind of documentation that told a story Harry recognized all too well. His father was abusive, Harry said quietly, the words carrying the weight of personal understanding. Maybe not to the same extent as the Dursleys, but there are patterns, signs. And his mother, Eileen Prince, came from a pure-blood family that disowned her for marrying a Muggle. So Severus grew up poor, probably abused, definitely isolated from both the Muggle and magical communities. Hermione's expression had grown increasingly troubled as Harry spoke. So when he met your mother, she was probably the first person who had ever been genuinely kind to him, Harry finished. The first person who saw past his circumstances to what he could become. No wonder he loved her. No wonder losing her friendship destroyed him. The conversation with Hermione helped clarify something that had been nagging at Harry since his experience in the Pensive, the recognition that his own life could easily have taken a similar path. If he hadn't had Hagrid to rescue him from the Dursleys, if he hadn't found Ron and Hermione's friendship at Hogwarts, if he had been sorted into a house that rewarded the kind of bitter ambition that poverty and abuse could foster. I judged him, Harry said, the admission tasting bitter in his mouth. For 6 years I judged him based on his behavior toward me without ever wondering what made him that way. Just like people judge me without knowing about the Dursleys, without understanding why I sometimes react badly to certain situations. That's different, Hermione said gently. You've never been deliberately cruel to other students the way Professor Snape has been to you. Haven't I? Harry asked, thinking of his treatment of Draco Malfoy, of the assumptions he had made about Slytherins in general. Maybe not to the same extent, but I've definitely let my prejudices influence my behavior. And maybe if I had grown up in Snape's circumstances, surrounded by people who told me that Muggleborns were inferior, that strength meant dominance, maybe I would have turned out worse. This line of thinking led Harry down paths he had never explored before, examining his own capacity for cruelty and the ways in which environment shaped character. He thought about Tom Riddle, about the lonely boy who had become Voldemort, and wondered whether different circumstances might have produced a different outcome. But it was Ron who provided the counterpoint Harry needed, approaching him after dinner with the blunt honesty that sometimes made him the most valuable friend of all. Hermione told me about your conversation, Ron said without preamble, settling onto Harry's bed in the dormitory with the comfortable familiarity of 6 years of friendship. And I get that you're trying to understand Snape better, I really do. But Harry, understanding why someone is cruel doesn't make the cruelty acceptable. I know that, Harry replied, though he wasn't entirely certain he did. I'm not saying we should excuse everything he's done. I'm just trying to understand why he's done it. And that's fine, as far as it goes, Ron continued, his voice gaining intensity. But you're starting to sound like you think his rough childhood gives him the right to make other people miserable. And that's not fair to Neville, who's been terrified of Snape since first year, or to any of the other students he's tormented. Ron's words hit harder than Harry had expected, forcing him to confront the possibility that his newfound empathy for Snape might be clouding his judgment about the man's actions. It was true that understanding the source of someone's pain didn't automatically absolve them of responsibility for passing that pain on to others. You're right, Harry said finally. I suppose I'm trying to find a way to balance things, to hold both truths at the same time, that Snape has done genuinely harmful things, and that he's also a person who's been shaped by experiences he couldn't control. That's very mature of you, Ron said with a slight smile. Annoyingly mature, actually. But just remember, whatever happened to him as a child, he's an adult now. He's had 20 years to work through his issues, and instead he's chosen to take them out on students who had nothing to do with his problems. The conversation with Ron provided the perspective Harry needed to approach his next potions lesson with something resembling objectivity. As he took his usual seat and prepared his cauldron, Harry found himself observing Snape with new eyes, not the rose-colored glasses of excessive sympathy, but the clearer vision of someone trying to see the complete person, rather than just the surface presentation. What he saw was complex and troubling in equal measure. Snape's movements around the classroom were precise to the point of being ritualistic, each gesture controlled and deliberate in a way that suggested decades of practiced discipline. His knowledge of his subject was undeniable. Even Harry could see that the man's understanding of potions theory went far beyond what was required for teaching sixth-year students. But there was also the familiar cruelty, the cutting remarks designed to humiliate rather than educate, the obvious pleasure Snape took in making students doubt their own abilities. When Neville accidentally added too much powdered moonstone to his confusion draft, Snape's response was swift and devastating. 10 points from Gryffindor, Longbottom, for your inability to follow simple instructions. Perhaps you should consider whether you possess the intellectual capacity for advanced study, or if your time might be better spent pursuing more elementary pursuits. Harry watched Neville's face crumple with shame and felt his anger flare with familiar intensity. Understanding Snape's childhood trauma was one thing. Watching him deliberately destroy a student's confidence was another entirely. After class, as students filed out with the subdued expressions that usually followed Snape's more vicious moods, Harry lingered behind. Not to confront the professor, he wasn't ready for that level of directness yet, but to observe him in the aftermath of his own cruelty. What he saw surprised him. Snape stood alone among the cauldrons, his posture suggesting exhaustion rather than satisfaction. He cleaned up the evidence of the lesson's disasters with movements that seemed almost mechanical, and for just a moment his carefully maintained mask slipped enough for Harry to see something that might have been regret. It was a brief glimpse, gone almost before Harry could process it, but it suggested a level of self-awareness that Harry hadn't expected. Perhaps Snape knew exactly how harmful his teaching methods were. Perhaps he regretted his cruelty, even as he seemed unable to stop inflicting it. The thought followed Harry through the rest of the day, creating an uncomfortable tension between his growing understanding of Snape's pain and his awareness of the pain Snape caused others. It was easier to hate someone who seemed to enjoy being cruel than to understand someone who might be trapped in patterns of behavior they couldn't escape. That night, Harry dreamed of being 9 years old and completely alone. In the dream, he wandered through a grey industrial landscape, calling out for someone, anyone, who might understand what it felt like to be different, to be capable of impossible things that frightened and amazed in equal measure. The loneliness in the dream was so profound that it felt like a physical weight, pressing down on his chest until he could barely breathe. He woke gasping, his heart racing with the lingering terror of absolute isolation. For a moment, he couldn't separate the dream from reality, couldn't remember where he was or why the dormitory around him felt safe rather than threatening. And then, gradually, the familiar details of his life at Hogwarts reasserted themselves. The warm weight of blankets, the sound of his dorm mates breathing peacefully in the beds around him, the knowledge that downstairs in the common room the embers of the fire still glowed with welcoming warmth. Harry had never been alone the way Snape had been alone. Even during his worst moments with the Dursleys, he had carried the unconscious certainty that there was something else waiting for him, some other world where he might belong. Snape had found that world in his friendship with Lily, only to lose it through his own choices and the prejudices of others. The dream left Harry with a profound sense of compassion for the child Snape had been, and a clearer understanding of how that child had grown into the man who now made his life difficult. It didn't excuse Snape's behavior, but it explained the desperate hunger that seemed to drive everything he did, the need to prove himself worthy, the fear of abandonment, the defensive cruelty that kept others at a distance before they could reject him. As the days passed, Harry found himself seeing connections everywhere, between his own experiences with the Dursleys and Snape's apparent family trauma, between his own struggles with identity and belonging, and the choices that had led Snape to join the Death Eaters. The parallels were uncomfortable and enlightening in equal measure. During a particularly challenging Defense Against the Dark Arts lesson, Professor Lupin discussed the psychological effects of prolonged exposure to dark magic, explaining how trauma could make individuals more susceptible to its influence. Those who feel powerless, Lupin said, his gentle voice carrying clearly through the classroom, are often drawn to ideologies that promise them control, even if that control comes at the cost of their own moral compass. Understanding this doesn't excuse their choices, but it does help us recognize the warning signs and perhaps intervene before someone crosses lines that cannot be uncrossed. Harry thought immediately of young Severus, isolated and desperate for belonging, surrounded by older students who offered acceptance in exchange for embracing their prejudices. How easy it would have been to trade his friendship with a Muggle-born girl for the security of fitting in with his housemates. How natural it would have seemed to choose the power that came with aligning himself with those who shared his pain and offered him a place in their vision of the world. The realization that Snape's fall from grace had been as much about survival as ideology added another layer to Harry's understanding. This wasn't the story of someone who had been seduced by abstract ideals of blood purity, but of a child who had been willing to betray everything he claimed to value in exchange for not being alone. The most tragic cases, Lupin continued, as if reading Harry's thoughts, are those who understand exactly what they're giving up when they make these choices. They sacrifice their connection to the people they love most because they can't bear the thought of continuing to face the world without allies. After class, Harry approached Lupin with a question that had been burning in his mind since their conversation began. "Professor," he said carefully, "do you think someone can come back from that kind of choice? If they realize what they've lost and genuinely want to make amends?" Lupin studied Harry with the kind of gentle perception that had always made him an exceptional teacher. "That's a complex question, Harry. I think the capacity for redemption exists in most people. But redemption requires more than just regret. It requires the willingness to accept responsibility for one's actions and to make concrete changes that demonstrate genuine transformation. And if someone has been doing that for 20 years, making those concrete changes, protecting people, fighting against the ideology they once embraced, then I would say that person has earned the right to be judged by their current actions rather than their past mistakes," Lupin replied. "Though I would also say that the people they harmed along the way have the right to decide whether and how to offer forgiveness." The conversation with Lupin helped Harry clarify his own position regarding Snape. Understanding the professor's childhood trauma and the circumstances that had led to his choices with the Death Eaters didn't obligate Harry to forgive the years of cruelty he had endured, but it did obligate him to see Snape as a complete human being, rather than a one-dimensional antagonist. That evening, as Harry sat in the common room, attempting to focus on his homework, he found himself thinking about the delicate balance between justice and mercy, between holding people accountable for their actions and recognizing the complex factors that shaped those actions. It was the kind of moral complexity that had no easy answers, the kind of grey area that made real life so much more challenging than the clear-cut narratives of fairy tales. Ron joined him at the table, spreading his own assignments across the scarred wood with the resigned air of someone facing an unpleasant but necessary task. "You've been thinking about Snape again," Ron observed without looking up from his Transfiguration essay. "You get this particular expression when you're trying to work out complicated emotional problems. Am I that obvious? To someone who's known you for 6 years? Absolutely." Ron set down his quill and fixed Harry with a direct stare. "So what conclusions have you reached about our favorite potions master?" Harry considered the question carefully, weighing his words before speaking. "I think he's a deeply damaged person who's spent 20 years trying to atone for terrible choices he made as a teenager. I think his cruelty towards students comes from the same place as his protection of me. His inability to separate the past from the present, his failure to develop healthy ways of processing his emotions." "That's very comprehensive," Ron said slowly, "and probably accurate. But Harry, what are you planning to do with this understanding?" It was the question Harry had been avoiding, even in his own thoughts. Understanding Snape was one thing. Deciding how to act on that understanding was something else entirely. He couldn't simply pretend that their history of antagonism didn't exist, but he also couldn't ignore the profound shift in his perception of the man's motivations and character. "I don't know yet," Harry admitted, "but I think I need to try to see him differently. Not as the enemy I've always believed him to be, but as someone who's fighting the same war I am, just with different weapons and different wounds." Ron nodded thoughtfully, accepting Harry's reasoning with the kind of loyal understanding that had sustained their friendship through 6 years of increasingly complex moral challenges. As the evening wore on and the common room gradually emptied of students heading to bed, Harry remained at his table, staring into the dying fire and thinking about the strange alchemy that transforms pain into either wisdom or cruelty. He thought about the choice that faced everyone who had been hurt by the world, whether to use that hurt as a weapon against others or as a source of compassion for those who suffered similarly. Somewhere in the depths of Hogwarts, Professor Severus Snape was probably grading essays with his usual ruthless precision, unaware that the boy he had tormented for 6 years was finally beginning to understand the complex calculus of love and loss that had shaped his life. And Harry, warm and safe in the embrace of friendships that had never known betrayal, found himself hoping that understanding might be the first step toward something resembling peace between them. Chapter 6. The Weight of Secrets. The hardest part of carrying secrets, Harry discovered, was not the knowledge itself, but the way it transformed every ordinary interaction into a performance. 2 weeks after his journey through Snape's memories, he found himself sitting in potions class with the familiar weight of his cauldron before him, and the unfamiliar weight of understanding pressing down on his shoulders like an invisible cloak. "Potter!" Snape's voice cut through the general murmur of students preparing their ingredients. "Your knife work is appalling. The beetroot eyes should be sliced, not hacked into irregular chunks that will dissolve unevenly and ruin the entire draft." 6 weeks ago, Harry would have bristled at the criticism, would have assumed that Snape was finding fault where none existed, simply for the pleasure of humiliating him in front of his classmates. Now, he found himself looking down at his chopping board and realizing that Snape was absolutely right. The beetroot eyes were indeed unevenly cut, and the irregularity would almost certainly affect the potion's stability. "Yes, Professor," Harry said quietly, setting down his knife and beginning again with more careful attention to precision. The response clearly surprised Snape, whose dark eyes narrowed as he studied Harry's face for signs of sarcasm or hidden defiance. Finding none, he moved on to terrorize Neville with his usual efficiency, but not before Harry caught a glimpse of something that might have been confusion flickering across the professor's features. As the lesson progressed, Harry found himself paying attention to Snape's instructions with a level of focus that had been entirely absent from his previous 5 years of potions study. When the professor demonstrated the proper stirring technique for incorporating powdered silver unicorn horn, Harry watched carefully and adjusted his own method accordingly. When Snape warned the class about the dangers of overheating a clarifying draught, Harry immediately lowered the flame beneath his cauldron. The result was the best potion Harry had ever brewed in Snape's class, clear, silver, and emitting exactly the kind of gentle luminescence described in their textbook. As he ladled a sample into a crystal phial for grading, Harry caught Snape watching him with an expression he couldn't interpret. Not approval, exactly, but something more complex. Surprise, perhaps, or a kind of wary assessment. "Adequate, Potter," Snape said when he examined Harry's submission, his voice carrying none of its usual disdain. "You may be capable of following instructions when you apply yourself properly." It was the closest thing to praise Harry had ever received from the potions master, and the lack of accompanying sarcasm made it somehow more unsettling than outright criticism would have been. As the class filed out, Harry found himself wondering if Snape's teaching methods had always been more constructive than he had realized, if his own prejudice and defensive anger had prevented him from learning what was actually being offered. The thought was deeply uncomfortable, suggesting as it did that Harry might have been partially responsible for the antagonistic dynamic that had characterized their relationship. Not equally responsible, Snape was the adult, the teacher, the one with the power to set the tone of their interactions, but perhaps more responsible than Harry had ever been willing to acknowledge. "That was weird," Ron observed, as they made their way to Defense Against the Dark Arts. "Snape almost sounded like he was trying to help you, instead of just pointing out everything you were doing wrong." "Maybe he was," Harry replied without thinking, then immediately regretted the words when Ron stopped walking and stared at him with open bewilderment. "Maybe he was what? Trying to help you?" "Harry, this is Snape we're talking about. The man who's made your life miserable since first year. The man who clearly wished you'd never been born." Harry struggled to find a response that wouldn't reveal too much about what he had learned. "I just meant that maybe his criticism wasn't entirely unfair. Maybe if I actually paid attention to what he was saying, instead of automatically assuming he was just being cruel. I might learn something. Ron's expression shifted from bewilderment to concern. Are you feeling all right? Because you sound like you're defending him, which is either a sign of serious illness or some kind of curse that's affecting your judgment. The conversation continued throughout their defense against the dark arts lesson, with Ron making increasingly elaborate jokes about Harry's apparent transformation and Hermione shooting worried glances in their direction. But Harry found it impossible to explain the shift in his perspective without revealing the memories that had caused it, and the secret felt too large and complicated to share, even with his closest friends. It was during lunch that Harry first noticed how isolating his newfound understanding of Snape had become. Dean Thomas was regaling their table with an elaborate impression of the potions master's dramatic reactions to student mistakes, his voice pitched to mimic Snape's distinctive sneer. "Your potion is so poorly prepared that it constitutes a crime against the art of potion-making itself," Dean quoted, gesturing dramatically with his fork. "Perhaps you should consider a career in something more suited to your intellectual limitations, such as professional unconsciousness." The table erupted in laughter, and Harry found himself smiling automatically, while something cold and uncomfortable settled in his stomach. 6 weeks ago, he would have been adding his own impressions to the performance, contributing his own collection of Snape's most cutting remarks. Now, all he could think about was the thin, serious boy who had once taught Lily Evans about magic with reverent enthusiasm. "Come on, Harry," Seamus encouraged. "You've got the best Snape stories of all of us. Tell them the one about the time he made you stay after class to sort beetle eyes by size." "I don't really feel like it," Harry said quietly, focusing on his shepherd's pie with unnecessary intensity. The response clearly puzzled his dormmates, who had come to expect Harry's enthusiastic participation in their regular Snape-mocking sessions. But before anyone could press the issue further, a commotion at the Hufflepuff table provided a welcome distraction, and the conversation moved on to safer topics. It was Hermione who cornered him after lunch, pulling him into an empty classroom with the determined expression that usually preceded her most thorough interrogations. "What's going on with you?" she asked without preamble. "You've been acting strangely for weeks, and it's getting worse. You're defending Professor Snape, you're avoiding conversations about him, and you look like you're carrying the weight of the world every time someone mentions his name." Harry leaned against a desk and tried to organize his thoughts into something approaching coherence. The urge to tell Hermione everything, about the memories, about Snape's childhood, about the profound love that had shaped 20 years of the man's choices, was almost overwhelming. But the memories weren't his to share, and he suspected that Snape's trust had been given with the implicit understanding that it wouldn't be betrayed to others. "I've just been thinking about things differently," he said finally. "About the way we judge people without really understanding their circumstances. About the way anger and pain can make people cruel, even when they don't want to be." Hermione studied his face with the careful attention of someone trying to solve a particularly complex problem. "This is about more than just philosophical reflection, isn't it? Something specific has changed your perspective on Professor Snape." "Maybe," Harry admitted. "But Hermione, some things are complicated in ways that can't be explained easily. And some knowledge comes with responsibilities that I'm not sure how to handle." It was the closest he could come to sharing the truth without actually revealing it, and Hermione seemed to understand that he was asking her to trust his judgment rather than demanding answers he couldn't provide. "All right," she said finally. "But Harry, if you need to talk about whatever this is, if it becomes too much to carry alone, you know I'm here. Whatever it is, whatever you've learned, we can work through it together." The kindness in her voice almost broke Harry's resolve to keep Snape's secrets, but he managed to nod his agreement without saying anything that would betray the trust that had been placed in him. The isolation only grew worse as the days passed. Every casual comment about Snape's unfairness, every joke about his greasy hair or his obvious favoritism towards Slytherin students felt like a small betrayal of the understanding Harry had gained. He found himself biting his tongue during conversations, forcing smiles during performances that no longer seemed funny, and struggling to maintain the easy camaraderie that had always characterized his friendships. It was during a particularly elaborate dinner conversation about whether Snape actually slept, hanging upside down like a bat, that Harry finally snapped. "Maybe we should talk about something else," he said, his voice sharper than he had intended. "Maybe there are more interesting topics than Professor Snape's personal habits." The table fell silent, with Ron and Dean exchanging the kind of meaningful looks that suggested they were seriously concerned about Harry's mental state. "Mate," Ron said carefully, "you're starting to worry us. Since when do you object to making fun of Snape? Since when do you defend him?" "I'm not defending him," Harry replied, though even to himself the protestation sounded weak. "I'm just tired of the same conversations over and over again. Don't we have better things to discuss?" But the damage was done. For the rest of the evening, Harry could feel his friends watching him, with the kind of careful attention usually reserved for potentially dangerous magical creatures. Their concern was palpable and well-intentioned, but it only served to emphasize how alone he felt with his newfound understanding. That night, lying in his dormitory bed while his roommates slept peacefully around him, Harry found himself thinking about the adults in his life who had kept secrets from him. Dumbledore, who had hidden the prophecy until the very last moment. Lupin, who had failed to mention his connection to Sirius during his third year. Sirius himself, who had kept the truth about his relationship with Harry's father carefully edited to preserve certain illusions. All of them had claimed to be protecting Harry, shielding him from information they deemed too dangerous or painful for him to handle. All of them had seemed to believe that ignorance was kinder than knowledge, that some truths were too heavy for young shoulders to bear. Now, carrying his own burden of hidden understanding, Harry began to appreciate the complexity of those decisions. Knowledge did change things, sometimes in ways that made life more difficult rather than easier. Understanding Snape's motivations hadn't made their relationship simpler. If anything, it had made every interaction fraught with complications that Harry didn't know how to navigate. The next morning brought another uncomfortable moment during potions class, when Snape assigned Harry a detention for failing to properly clean his cauldron after the previous lesson. "Saturday evening, Potter, 7 o'clock. You will assist me in preparing ingredients for the advanced classes." The announcement was delivered with Snape's usual cold efficiency, but as Harry nodded his acceptance, he caught something in the professor's expression that seemed almost tentative, as if the detention were as much an invitation as a punishment, an opportunity for further conversation that neither of them quite knew how to initiate directly. The possibility that Snape might be struggling with the same complications that plagued Harry, the difficulty of reconciling past antagonism with present understanding, had never occurred to him before. But as he watched the professor move through the classroom with his usual precise authority, Harry found himself wondering if the man was also carrying the burden of secrets that couldn't be shared, of emotions that couldn't be easily expressed. The detention itself proved to be unlike any Harry had previously endured. Instead of the usual mind-numbing tasks designed purely for punishment, Snape set him to work preparing ingredients that clearly required skill and attention, slicing fairy wings into precise strips, grinding moonstone to a specific consistency, bottling essence of dittany with careful attention to proper preservation techniques. They worked in relative silence, the only sounds the soft scraping of knives against cutting boards and the gentle bubbling of potions brewing in the background. But the silence felt different from the hostile tension that had characterized their previous interactions. Not comfortable exactly, but not entirely antagonistic either. "Your technique has improved," Snape observed, as Harry finished bottling his third vial of dittany essence. "Marginally, but noticeably." "Thank you, Professor," Harry replied, unsure whether the comment was meant as praise or simple observation. Snape paused in his own work, studying Harry with the same unreadable expression that had been appearing more frequently in recent weeks. "You seem different lately, Potter. Less reflexively hostile. I confess myself curious about what has prompted this change." The question was clearly an opening, an invitation for Harry to acknowledge what had passed between them during their previous conversations. But Harry found himself paralyzed by the complexity of what such an acknowledgement might lead to. How could he explain that understanding Snape's love for his mother had fundamentally altered his perception of their relationship? How could he admit that sympathy had complicated his anger without diminishing his awareness of the genuine harm that had been done? "People change," Harry said finally, the response feeling inadequate even as he spoke it. "Indeed they do," Snape agreed, his voice carrying an undertone of something that might have been regret, though not always for reasons that others can understand or appreciate. They finished the detention without further conversation, but as Harry prepared to leave, Snape made an unexpected observation. "Your mother possessed the capacity to see beyond surface appearances to the complex realities beneath," he said quietly, not looking up from the essay he was grading. "It was one of her most remarkable qualities, and one of the most dangerous, from a practical standpoint." The comment was clearly meant as more than casual observation, but before Harry could formulate a response, Snape had returned his attention to his work with the kind of focused intensity that suggested the conversation was over. Walking back to Gryffindor Tower through the castle's quiet corridors, Harry found himself thinking about the strange burden of carrying understanding that couldn't be shared, of possessing knowledge that transformed every interaction without providing clear guidance about how to use that knowledge constructively. He thought about his mother, who had apparently possessed the same dangerous gift for seeing past surface antagonism to the wounded humanity beneath. He wondered if she had ever felt the same isolation he was experiencing now, the loneliness of understanding people in ways that their behavior seemed to contradict, of holding compassion for those who seemed determined to reject it. The next few weeks settled into a pattern of careful navigation as Harry learned to manage his transformed understanding of Snape while maintaining the relationships that anchored his life at Hogwarts. It required a constant vigilance, a careful monitoring of his responses to ensure that his new perspective didn't alienate his friends or reveal secrets that weren't his to share. But the effort was exhausting, and Harry found himself increasingly aware of the weight that secrets carried, not just their own inherent complexity, but the way they changed the person who bore them. Every conversation became a potential minefield, every casual comment a test of his ability to maintain the careful balance between truth and concealment. During a particularly challenging afternoon, when Ron had been especially vocal about Snape's latest classroom cruelties, Harry excused himself early from their study session in the common room and found refuge in the castle's quieter corridors. He wandered without particular destination, simply seeking space to breathe and think without the constant pressure of performance. It was in one of these empty hallways that he encountered Professor McGonagall, who seemed to materialize from the shadows with the uncanny timing that all teachers seemed to possess. "Mr. Potter," she said, her voice carrying the kind of gentle concern that suggested she had noticed his recent distraction. "You seem troubled. Is there anything you'd care to discuss?" For a moment, Harry considered the possibility of confiding in McGonagall about what he had learned. She had known his parents, had taught both Lily and Snape, might be able to provide the kind of context and guidance that Harry desperately needed. But the thought of betraying Snape's trust, of revealing the vulnerability that had been shared in private, made the option feel impossible. Whatever else might be true about their relationship, Snape had trusted him with memories that were clearly precious and painful, and that trust carried obligations that Harry wasn't prepared to violate. "Just thinking about things, Professor," Harry said finally, "about how complicated people can be, about how difficult it is to know what to do with information that changes everything you thought you understood." McGonagall studied him with the sharp intelligence that had made her an exceptional teacher for decades. Wisdom often comes with the price of complexity, Mr. Potter. The more we understand about the people around us, the more difficult it becomes to maintain simple judgments about their character. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? Both, I suspect, McGonagall replied with a slight smile. Wisdom makes us more compassionate, but it also makes us more lonely. It's easier to share simple emotions with others than complex understanding. The conversation provided exactly the kind of validation Harry needed, confirmation that his struggle with carrying secrets and complicated knowledge was not unique or abnormal, but it also emphasized the ongoing nature of his isolation, the way that understanding had created distance even in his closest relationships. That evening, as Harry sat in the common room pretending to focus on his Transfiguration homework while his friends discussed Quidditch strategies and upcoming exams, he found himself thinking about the strange alchemy that transforms hatred into sympathy, anger into understanding, certainty into confusion. 6 weeks ago, his feelings about Snape had been clear and uncomplicated. The man was cruel, unfair, and apparently motivated by nothing more constructive than petty vindictiveness. Now, Harry carried the knowledge of a love that had shaped 20 years of choices, of a childhood that had been marked by poverty and isolation, of decisions made in desperation that had consequences no one could have foreseen. The knowledge didn't excuse Snape's cruelty toward his students, didn't make his teaching methods acceptable, didn't transform their antagonistic relationship into friendship, but it made everything infinitely more complex, charged every interaction with undercurrents of meaning that Harry struggled to interpret. As he climbed the stairs to his dormitory that night, Harry found himself wondering if this was what growing up truly meant, not the accumulation of privileges and responsibilities, but the gradual recognition that every person carried hidden depths of pain and motivation that simple judgments couldn't encompass. It was a lonely kind of wisdom, made more isolating by the necessity of keeping it secret. But as Harry settled into his bed and listened to the familiar sounds of his dorm-mates preparing for sleep, he found himself oddly grateful for the burden he carried. Because understanding Snape, really understanding him, meant understanding something important about the nature of love itself, how it could survive betrayal and loss, how it could motivate both protection and cruelty, how it could transform even the most bitter heart into something capable of sacrifice. And perhaps, Harry thought, as sleep finally claimed him, that understanding might eventually lead to something more constructive than the careful antagonism that currently defined their relationship. Perhaps wisdom, however lonely, was still preferable to the simple certainties that had once made his world feel smaller and safer, but ultimately less true. Outside his window, the grounds of Hogwarts stretched away into darkness, holding their own secrets and their own stories of love and loss, and the complicated alchemy that transforms children into the adults they eventually become. Chapter 7. Friendship Under Strain. The first real crack in their friendship appeared on a Tuesday evening in mid-February, when the common room was filled with the comfortable buzz of students working on homework and gossiping about the upcoming Hogsmeade weekend. Harry sat at their usual table near the fireplace, ostensibly reviewing his defense against the dark arts notes, while actually thinking about the subtle changes he had noticed in Snape's behavior since their conversation about Lily's memories. Ron was regaling Seamus and Dean with an elaborate retelling of that afternoon's potions lesson, complete with theatrical gestures and an exaggerated impression of Snape's most cutting remarks. His audience was appreciative, offering encouraging laughter and adding their own observations about their professor's various cruelties. And then, Ron continued, his voice pitched to mimic Snape's distinctive sneer, he told Neville that his potion was so poorly executed that it constituted a war crime against the concept of magical education itself. A war crime, can you believe it? Against education! The table erupted in laughter, and Seamus immediately launched into his own Snape impression, focusing on the professor's habit of looming over students until they became so nervous that they inevitably made mistakes. It was the kind of casual mockery that had characterized their potions discussions for 6 years, harmless enough in its way, familiar as breathing. But Harry found himself unable to join in with his usual enthusiasm. Instead of laughing, he felt a growing discomfort that settled in his stomach like badly prepared food. Every exaggerated gesture, every mimicked sneer, felt like a betrayal of the trust Snape had placed in him when he shared those precious memories. "Come on, Harry," Dean encouraged. "You must have something to add. You've been on the receiving end of more Snape abuse than the rest of us combined." "I don't really feel like it," Harry said quietly, not looking up from his notes. The response clearly surprised his dorm mates, but before they could press the issue, Ron launched into another story, this one about Snape's reaction to a Hufflepuff student's accidental explosion of a calming draft. Harry listened with growing discomfort, each cruel imitation feeling more wrong than the last. It was when Ron began describing Snape's appearance in particularly unflattering terms, his greasy hair, his yellowed teeth, his resemblance to various unpleasant creatures, that Harry finally reached his breaking point. "Maybe we could talk about something else," he said, his voice sharper than he had intended. The suggestion was met with a moment of confused silence, followed by the kind of meaningful looks that suggested his friends were genuinely concerned about his mental state. "Something else?" Ron repeated, as if the concept were foreign to him. "Harry, making fun of Snape is one of our oldest traditions. We've been doing it since first year." "Well, maybe it's time to develop some new traditions," Harry replied, immediately regretting the defensive edge in his voice. Ron set down his quill and fixed Harry with a direct stare that carried 6 years of friendship and increasing bewilderment. "What's wrong with you? For the past month, you've been acting like you don't want to hear anything negative about Snape. You defend him during conversations, you won't participate when we joke about him, and you actually seem to be paying attention in his classes. It's like you've been replaced by some bizarro version of yourself." The observation was accurate and deeply uncomfortable, forcing Harry to confront the extent to which his changed perspective had altered his behavior. But how could he explain that understanding Snape's love for his mother had fundamentally shifted his perception of the man's character? How could he reveal the memories that had shown him a lonely child who had treasured Lily's friendship above everything else in his world? "People change, Ron," Harry said finally, though the words felt inadequate even as he spoke them. "Maybe I'm just tired of focusing on the negative aspects of everything. Maybe I want to try understanding people instead of just mocking at them." "Understanding people?" Ron's voice rose with incredulity. "Harry, this is Severus Snape we're talking about. The man who has made your life miserable since the moment you set foot in his classroom. The man who clearly wishes you had never been born. What exactly is there to understand about deliberate cruelty?" Harry felt his frustration building, fed by the impossibility of explaining his position without betraying confidences that weren't his to share. "Maybe his cruelty comes from somewhere," he said carefully. "Maybe there are reasons for the way he behaves that we don't understand." "Oh, brilliant!" Ron shot back, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "So now we're making excuses for him? What's next, Harry? Are you going to start defending Voldemort because he had a difficult childhood?" The comparison stung, partly because it contained an element of truth that Harry didn't want to acknowledge. There was a difference between understanding someone's motivations and excusing their harmful actions, but the line between the two was blurrier than he had expected. "That's not what I'm saying," Harry replied, his voice tight with controlled anger. "I'm saying that maybe, just maybe, the world is more complicated than we thought when we were 11 years old. Maybe people do terrible things for complex reasons, and maybe understanding those reasons doesn't excuse the behavior, but helps us figure out how to respond to it." "That's very philosophical of you," Ron said, his tone making it clear that philosophy was not something he particularly valued at the moment. "But while you're busy understanding Snape's complex motivations, The rest of us still have to deal with the reality of his behavior. Neville is still terrified of him. He's still taking points from Gryffindor for imaginary infractions. He's still treating every lesson like an opportunity to humiliate students who don't meet his impossible standards. Harry wanted to argue, wanted to point out that Snape's standards weren't impossible if students actually paid attention to his instructions, or that his corrections were often more helpful than cruel if viewed from the right perspective. But even thinking the words felt like a betrayal of every student who had suffered under Snape's harsh teaching methods. "You're right," he said finally, the admission feeling like defeat. "He does do those things, and they're wrong. But that doesn't mean we have to respond to his cruelty with our own cruelty. That doesn't mean we have to participate in mocking him just because he's made our lives difficult." Ron stared at him for a long moment, his expression cycling through confusion, frustration, and something that might have been hurt. "You really have changed," he said, quietly. "I don't know what's happened to you, Harry, but you're not the same person who used to complain about Snape with the rest of us. You're not the same person who understood why the rest of us needed to blow off steam about the professor who makes our lives miserable." The accusation hit harder than Harry had expected, forcing him to confront the possibility that his changed perspective might be isolating him from the friends who had supported him through 6 years of increasingly complex challenges. But he couldn't bring himself to return to the easy mockery that had once characterized their discussions about Snape, couldn't participate in conversations that felt like betrayals of the understanding he had gained. "I'm still me," he said weakly, though he wasn't entirely certain that was true. "Are you?" Ron asked. "Because the Harry Potter I know would never defend Severus Snape. The Harry Potter I know would understand why the rest of us need to laugh about him sometimes, instead of getting all sanctimonious about our cruelty towards someone who has never shown us anything but contempt." The argument continued for another 20 minutes, their voices rising enough to attract concerned glances from other students in the common room. Hermione eventually intervened, steering the conversation towards safer topics with the diplomatic skill that had gotten them through 6 years of friendship and crisis. But the damage was done. A rift had opened between Harry and Ron that mere conversation couldn't easily repair. Over the next few days, the tension between them became increasingly obvious to everyone around them. Ron made pointed comments about people who had apparently forgotten which side they were supposed to be on. Harry responded with defensive remarks about the value of trying to understand complex situations. Their friends watched the exchanges with growing concern, clearly unsure how to navigate the conflict that had emerged between two people who had been inseparable for years. It was during their next potions lesson that the situation reached a crisis point. Ron, clearly frustrated by Harry's recent behavior and looking for a way to force his friend back into their traditional alliance, deliberately provoked an incident that would require Harry to choose sides. When Snape turned his attention to grading essays at his desk, Ron began an elaborate pantomime of the professor's mannerisms, exaggerating his gestures and facial expressions for the entertainment of nearby students. It was exactly the kind of performance that would normally have earned Harry's enthusiastic participation, and Ron kept shooting meaningful glances in his direction, clearly expecting support. But Harry found himself unable to join in. Instead, he focused on his potion with unusual intensity, trying to pretend that he wasn't aware of the performance taking place 3 feet away from him. The deliberate ignorance felt like cowardice, but participating felt like betrayal. "Potter," Ron hissed under his breath. "What are you doing? This is perfect Snape material." "I'm working on my potion," Harry replied quietly, not looking up from his cauldron. "Since when do you care about your potion more than a good Snape impression?" Before Harry could respond, Snape's voice cut through the general murmur of the classroom with the precision of a well-aimed spell. "Mr. Weasley," he said, his tone deceptively mild, "perhaps you could share with the class what you find so amusing about the preparation of Euphoria elixir." Ron's performance froze mid-gesture, his face flushing red with embarrassment and defiance. "Nothing, Professor," he said, his voice carrying just enough sarcasm to suggest that respect was not among his current priorities. Indeed? How fascinating. Then perhaps you could explain why you feel compelled to entertain your classmates with what appears to be an impression of someone suffering from a severe neurological disorder. The classroom fell silent, every student suddenly finding their potions intensely interesting. Harry kept his eyes fixed on his cauldron, but he could feel Ron's expectant gaze burning into the side of his head. This was the moment when he would normally leap to his friend's defense, when he would offer some distraction or share the blame to protect Ron from Snape's worst retaliation. But he couldn't bring himself to do it. The thought of deliberately provoking Snape, of treating him as a target for their amusement, felt wrong in ways that Harry couldn't begin to explain without revealing everything he had learned about the man's character. "Well, Mr. Potter," Snape said, his dark eyes shifting to Harry with an expression that might have been curiosity. "Do you have any insight into your friend's apparent medical condition?" It was a perfect opening, an invitation for Harry to participate in the kind of confrontation that had characterized their relationship for 6 years. But instead of taking the bait, Harry found himself meeting Snape's gaze directly and speaking with careful honesty. "No, Professor. Ron was just... he wasn't thinking clearly. I'm sure he didn't mean anything by it." The response clearly surprised everyone in the classroom, including Snape, whose eyebrows rose slightly at Harry's unexpected diplomacy. Ron stared at his friend with an expression of complete bewilderment, as if Harry had suddenly begun speaking a foreign language. "How diplomatic of you, Mr. Potter," Snape said slowly, his voice carrying an undertone of something that might have been approval. "Perhaps there is hope for your generation after all. Mr. Weasley, you will serve detention with me this Saturday evening, and in the future you might consider following your friend's example in matters of classroom behavior." As the lesson continued, Harry could feel Ron's increasing anger radiating from the seat beside him. Every glance, every gesture, every carefully controlled movement suggested a friend who felt deeply betrayed by what he perceived as Harry's abandonment at a crucial moment. The confrontation came immediately after class, when Ron cornered Harry in an empty corridor with the kind of focused intensity that had characterized his most serious moments since first year. "What the hell was that?" he demanded, his voice tight with anger and hurt. "Since when do you defend Snape against me? Since when do you leave me to face his detention alone when you could have shared the blame?" Harry struggled to find words that might explain his position without revealing the secrets he was bound to protect. "Ron, you were deliberately provoking him. You knew what would happen." "Of course I knew what would happen," Ron shot back. "That was the point. But I also knew that you would back me up, the way you always have. The way friends are supposed to support each other when they're facing someone who's been treating them badly for years." "Maybe that's exactly the problem," Harry said, his frustration finally breaking through his attempts at diplomacy. "Maybe we've been treating this like a game when it's actually someone's life. Maybe Snape has reasons for being the way he is that we've never bothered to consider." "There you go again," Ron said, his voice rising with exasperation. "Defending him. Making excuses for him. Harry, listen to yourself. You're talking about Severus Snape like he's some misunderstood victim instead of the man who has made our lives miserable for 6 years. "I'm not making excuses," Harry replied, though he wasn't entirely certain that was true. "I'm trying to understand the difference between someone being cruel because they enjoy it and someone being cruel because they don't know how to be anything else." "And what exactly has given you this amazing insight into Snape's psychology?" Ron demanded. "What's changed in the last few months that's turned you into his unofficial defender?" The question was fair and unanswerable, at least in any way that wouldn't betray the trust that Snape had placed in him. Harry found himself trapped between his loyalty to his oldest friend and his obligation to protect secrets that weren't his to reveal. "Things are complicated, Ron," he said finally, the words feeling inadequate even as he spoke them. "Sometimes you learn things that change your perspective on people, and once you know them, You can't go back to seeing the world the way you did before. That's not an answer, Ron said flatly. That's the kind of non-answer that people give when they don't trust their friends enough to tell them the truth. The accusation stung because it contained more truth than Harry wanted to acknowledge. He wasn't telling Ron the truth, couldn't tell him the truth without violating confidences that had been shared in private. But his inability to explain his changed perspective was clearly damaging the friendship that had anchored his life at Hogwarts. Some things can't be explained easily, Harry said quietly. Some knowledge comes with responsibilities that make it impossible to share. Responsibilities to who? Ron demanded. To Snape? Harry, whatever he's told you, whatever he's done to make you think differently about him, he doesn't deserve your loyalty more than I do. We've been friends for 6 years. Doesn't that count for anything? The pain in Ron's voice was unmistakable, and Harry felt his chest tighten with the recognition that his attempts to honor his understanding of Snape were causing genuine hurt to someone who had never been anything but loyal to him. Of course it counts, Harry said desperately. Ron, you're one of my best friends. You've stood by me through everything. But this isn't about choosing between you and Snape. This is about trying to figure out how to be fair to everyone involved. Fair, Ron repeated, his voice sharp with incredulity. Harry, Snape has never been fair to any of us. He's taken points from Gryffindor for breathing too loudly. He's humiliated students for asking questions. He's made Neville so terrified of potions that the poor kid has nightmares about cauldrons exploding. Where's the fairness in defending someone like that? Harry wanted to argue, wanted to explain that Snape's cruelty came from a place of profound pain rather than simple malice, that understanding his motivations didn't excuse his behavior, but might provide a path toward something better than their current antagonism. But the words felt impossible to speak without revealing everything he had learned about Lily's friendship and Snape's decades of grief. You're right, he said finally, the admission feeling like surrender. Snape has been cruel to students. He's been unfair and harsh and sometimes downright abusive. But Ron, that doesn't mean we have to respond to his cruelty with our own. That doesn't mean we have to participate in mocking him just because he's made our lives difficult. So what are you suggesting? Ron asked, his voice heavy with frustration. That we just accept his abuse without complaint? That we pretend he's been a wonderful teacher who deserves our respect and gratitude? I'm suggesting that we try to be better than he is, Harry replied. I'm suggesting that maybe there are ways to deal with difficult people that don't involve deliberate cruelty or public humiliation. Ron stared at him for a long moment, his expression cycling through anger, confusion, and something that might have been disappointment. You really have changed, he said quietly. I don't know what's happened to you, Harry, but you're not the same person who used to understand why the rest of us needed to stick together against teachers who treated us badly. The conversation ended in stalemate, with both boys feeling hurt and misunderstood. Ron stalked off toward the common room with his shoulders rigid with anger, while Harry found himself alone in the corridor, wondering how trying to do the right thing had led to such painful consequences. Over the next few days, the rift between them became increasingly obvious to everyone in their social circle. Ron made pointed comments about people who had forgotten which side they were supposed to be on. Harry responded with careful attempts at neutrality that only seemed to make things worse. Their mutual friends watched the exchanges with growing concern, clearly unsure how to navigate a conflict that neither participant seemed willing to explain. It was Hermione who eventually took action, cornering Harry in the library during what had become his regular refuge from the tension in the common room. This has to stop, she said without preamble, settling into the chair across from him, with the determined expression that usually preceded her most thorough interventions. Whatever's going on between you and Ron, it's affecting everyone around you, and it's clearly making both of you miserable. Harry looked up from his Transfiguration homework, noting the concern in Hermione's expression and the way she was carefully choosing her words. I don't know how to fix it, he said honestly. I can't explain why I feel differently about Snape without revealing things that aren't mine to share. And Ron can't understand my behavior without that explanation. But you could try to find some middle ground, Hermione suggested gently. You could acknowledge that Ron's feelings are valid even if you don't share them completely. You could participate in your friendships without betraying whatever principles have become important to you. It was the kind of practical wisdom that had gotten them through 6 years of increasingly complex moral challenges, but Harry found himself struggling with the implications of what she was suggesting. How do I participate in conversations that feel like betrayals of everything I've learned? He asked. How do I laugh at jokes about someone when I understand things about them that make those jokes feel cruel rather than harmless? Hermione studied his face with the careful attention of someone trying to solve a particularly complex problem. Knowledge does change us, she said finally, and sometimes it isolates us from people who haven't learned the same things. But Harry, isolation isn't always the price of understanding. Sometimes wisdom involves learning how to honor what you know without alienating the people who care about you. And sometimes, Harry replied, thinking of the adults who had kept secrets from him throughout his life. Wisdom involves accepting that some knowledge can't be shared, even with the people you trust most. The conversation with Hermione helped clarify the nature of his dilemma without providing clear solutions. He was trapped between competing loyalties, his obligation to protect Snape's confidences and his desire to maintain the friendships that had sustained him through 6 years of increasingly dangerous challenges. That evening, as he sat alone at a table in the far corner of the common room, while Ron and their other dormmates played wizard's chess near the fireplace, Harry found himself thinking about the true cost of the understanding he had gained. It wasn't just the complexity of his feelings about Snape that was isolating him. It was the recognition that knowledge, once gained, could never be unknown. He thought about his mother, who had apparently possessed the same dangerous gift for seeing past surface antagonism to the wounded humanity beneath. He wondered if she had ever felt the same loneliness he was experiencing now, the burden of understanding people in ways that their behavior seemed to contradict, of holding compassion for those who seemed determined to reject it. The next morning brought another uncomfortable moment during breakfast, when the conversation at their table turned to the upcoming Quidditch match against Ravenclaw. It should have been a safe topic, something that could unite them in their shared excitement about a Gryffindor's chances. But even this familiar ground proved treacherous when someone mentioned Snape's obvious bias in his refereeing during previous matches. "Remember first year?" Dean said with a laugh, when he was so determined to help Slytherin win that he tried to curse Harry's broom. If Hermione hadn't set his robes on fire, Harry would have been thrown to his death just to ensure their victory. The table erupted in familiar laughter, and several people began sharing their own stories of Snape's favoritism and poor sportsmanship. It was exactly the kind of conversation that Harry had participated in dozens of times before, harmless enough in its way, simply friends sharing their frustrations about a teacher who had never shown them fairness or kindness. But Harry found himself remembering the thin, serious boy who had once taught Lily about magical creatures with patient enthusiasm, who had treasured her friendship enough to preserve a pressed flower for 20 years. The casual mockery of Snape's character felt wrong in ways that Harry couldn't explain without revealing everything he had learned. "Maybe we could talk about Quidditch strategy instead of referee complaints," he suggested quietly, immediately recognizing that his response would be interpreted as another defense of Snape. Ron's eyes narrowed as he fixed Harry with a direct stare. "There you go again," he said, his voice carrying the weight of accumulated frustration, defending him. "Even when we're talking about something completely different, you find a way to protect Severus Snape from criticism." "I'm not protecting him," Harry replied, though the protestation sounded weak even to himself. "I just think there might be more interesting things to discuss than our complaints about teachers." "Since when?" Dean asked, clearly puzzled by Harry's response. We've been complaining about teachers since first year. It's practically a Gryffindor tradition. Harry found himself trapped in another conversation where his changed perspective made normal social interaction feel impossible. Every attempt to redirect the discussion only seemed to emphasize how different his attitudes had become, how isolated his new understanding had made him from the friends who had always accepted him without question. That evening, after another day of careful navigation through conversations that felt like minefields, Harry made a decision that felt both necessary and heartbreaking. Instead of joining his friends for their usual study session in the common room, he gathered his books and found a secluded corner of the castle where he could work alone. It wasn't a permanent solution. He couldn't avoid his friends forever, couldn't maintain his isolation indefinitely without doing permanent damage to relationships that mattered to him. But for one evening at least, he could spare himself the exhausting effort of monitoring every response, of weighing every word against the possibility of revealing secrets that weren't his to share. As he settled into his solitary study session, Harry found himself thinking about the strange burden of carrying love for someone who had never asked for it, of understanding people who might prefer to remain misunderstood. The knowledge that had changed his perspective on Snape had also changed his perspective on friendship itself, revealing the ways that loyalty and honesty could come into conflict, the ways that wisdom could be a source of loneliness rather than connection. Outside the window, snow continued to fall over the grounds of Hogwarts, covering the familiar landscape in a blanket of white that made everything look clean and new. But Harry knew that beneath the surface, the old patterns remained, the same conflicts, the same misunderstandings, the same complex web of relationships that no amount of snow could simplify or resolve. Tomorrow, he would have to return to the common room, would have to find ways to navigate his friendships without betraying the understanding he had gained. He would have to learn how to honor what he knew about Snape while maintaining the connections that had sustained him through 6 years of increasingly complex moral challenges. But tonight, in the quiet solitude of his chosen exile, Harry allowed himself to grieve for the simplicity he had lost, for the time when hatred had been uncomplicated and friendship had been easy, when understanding someone's pain hadn't come with the price of isolation from the people he loved most. Chapter 8. Questioning Everything. The realization came to Harry during a routine Monday morning breakfast, triggered by nothing more dramatic than the sight of Dumbledore's eyes meeting Snape's across the Great Hall. It was the briefest of exchanges, a glance, a nearly imperceptible nod, a shared understanding that lasted perhaps 3 seconds before both men returned their attention to their respective duties. But in those 3 seconds, Harry saw something that had been hidden in plain sight for 6 years. The careful choreography of two people who understood each other far better than they allowed anyone else to observe. If Dumbledore knew about Snape's feelings for Lily, and how could he not, given his apparent awareness of everything else that happened within Hogwarts walls, then every defense of Snape's character, every insistence on his trustworthiness, every refusal to explain the source of that trust, suddenly made perfect sense. Dumbledore wasn't protecting Snape out of abstract belief in redemption or second chances. He was protecting a man whose love for Lily Evans had made him the most reliable ally in a war where loyalty was often purchased rather than earned. The understanding hit Harry with the force of a physical blow, making his toast taste like sawdust and his pumpkin juice feel too thick to swallow. For 6 years, he had accepted Dumbledore's cryptic explanations about trusting Snape without demanding specifics. For 6 years, he had assumed that the adults in his life were withholding information for his own protection, that their secrets were motivated by kindness rather than strategy. But what if Dumbledore's secrecy wasn't about protecting Harry from painful truths? What if it was about protecting valuable assets from exposure, about maintaining the careful web of relationships and obligations that kept essential people in their assigned roles? The thought was deeply unsettling, suggesting as it did that Harry's entire understanding of his relationship with Dumbledore might be built on foundations that were more pragmatic than paternal. How much of the headmaster's apparent care for Harry's welfare was genuine affection, and how much was investment in a weapon that needed to be properly maintained until it could be deployed against Voldemort. Over the next few days, Harry found himself observing the interactions between Dumbledore and Snape with the careful attention of someone trying to decode a complex cipher. What he saw only reinforced his growing suspicions about the calculated nature of their relationship. During staff meetings that Harry glimpsed through partially open doors, Dumbledore's treatment of Snape was markedly different from his interactions with other professors. There was a subtle deference in his manner, a careful attention to Snape's opinions that suggested the potion's master held more influence than his official position would indicate. When McGonagall disagreed with Dumbledore about disciplinary policies, the headmaster listened politely and made his own decisions. When Snape expressed concerns about security measures or student safety, Dumbledore's responses carried the weight of serious consideration. It was the behavior of someone managing a valuable but potentially volatile resource, someone who understood that maintaining cooperation required careful attention to the other party's concerns and motivations. Harry's growing awareness of these dynamics coincided with an increasing frustration about the amount of information that was apparently being withheld from him about his own life and relationships. Every casual reference to his parents' school years, every mention of old friendships and rivalries, every story about the first war against Voldemort, reminded him of how much he didn't know about the people and events that had shaped his existence. It was this frustration that finally drove him to seek a direct conversation with Dumbledore, though he approached the prospect with considerably more apprehension than he had felt during their previous discussions. The dynamics of their relationship had always been unequal. Harry the student seeking guidance, Dumbledore the wise mentor dispensing carefully measured wisdom. But now that inequality felt deliberate rather than natural. The request for a meeting was granted immediately, as Harry had known it would be. Dumbledore had never been difficult to reach when Harry needed to discuss important matters, though Harry was beginning to suspect that the ease of access was itself a form of management, a way of maintaining the illusion of openness while controlling the flow of information. Dumbledore's office looked exactly as it always had, filled with curious magical instruments, rotating portraits of former headmasters, and the general atmosphere of benevolent authority that had always made Harry feel simultaneously welcome and intimidated. But as Harry settled into the familiar chair across from Dumbledore's desk, he found himself noticing details that he had previously overlooked: the careful positioning of certain objects, the way some books were prominently displayed while others were notably absent, the subtle signs of a space that had been arranged to project specific impressions rather than reflect authentic personality. "Harry," Dumbledore said warmly, his blue eyes twinkling with what appeared to be genuine pleasure at the visit. "To what do I owe this unexpected pleasure? I hope you're not experiencing difficulties with your classes." "Not exactly, Professor," Harry replied, choosing his words carefully. "I wanted to ask you about my mother, specifically about her friendships during her time at Hogwarts." Something flickered across Dumbledore's expression, so briefly that Harry might have imagined it, but his voice remained steady and encouraging when he responded. "Ah, yes. Lily was well regarded by both students and staff during her years here. A brilliant witch, and remarkably kind to those around her. What particular aspect of her school experience interests you?" "Her friendship with Severus Snape," Harry said directly, watching Dumbledore's face for any sign of surprise or discomfort. The reaction was subtle but unmistakable. Dumbledore's hands, which had been resting casually on his desk, tensed slightly. His expression maintained its characteristic benevolence, but something in his eyes suggested careful calculation rather than spontaneous warmth. "Ah," he said after a moment's pause. "Yes, Severus and your mother were acquainted during their childhood and early school years. A friendship that unfortunately did not survive the pressures and divisions that characterized their time at Hogwarts." The response was perfectly crafted to sound informative, while revealing virtually nothing of substance, and Harry felt his frustration spike at the familiar pattern of evasion disguised as explanation. "They were more than acquainted," Harry pressed. They were close friends, childhood companions who cared deeply about each other. And I think you know considerably more about their relationship than you're admitting." Dumbledore leaned back in his chair, his expression shifting from casual interest to something approaching wariness. "Harry, may I ask what has prompted this particular line of inquiry? Has someone been sharing stories about your mother's school years?" "Does it matter who told me?" Harry replied, recognizing the deflection for what it was. "The point is that I've learned things about my mother and Professor Snape that no one has ever bothered to mention to me. Important things about their friendship, about why it ended, about what it meant to both of them." "And what, precisely, do you believe you have learned?" The question was posed with Dumbledore's characteristic gentleness, but Harry caught the underlying sharpness, the careful attention of someone trying to assess how much damage had been done to a carefully maintained narrative. "I've learned that Snape loved my mother," Harry said bluntly. "That he loved her from childhood, that he never stopped loving her, and that his protection of me has nothing to do with debt to my father or respect for your authority. It's about honoring her memory and trying to atone for choices that cost him her friendship." The silence that followed was heavy with implications. Dumbledore sat perfectly still, his expression cycling through what might have been surprise, resignation, and something that looked almost like relief. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that Harry had rarely heard from him. "I see that Severus has chosen to share more with you than I would have expected," he said carefully. "And I suspect that knowledge has raised questions about the nature of the relationships and obligations that bind us all together in this difficult time. It's raised questions about why no one has ever told me the truth about anything," Harry replied, his voice sharper than he had intended. "About why I've spent 6 years believing that Snape hated me because of my father, when the real reason is that I remind him of everything he lost when my mother died. And would knowing that have made your relationship with Severus easier to navigate?" Dumbledore asked gently. "Would understanding the source of his pain have reduced its impact on your daily interactions?" The question was fair and uncomfortable, forcing Harry to confront the possibility that some information was withheld for practical rather than manipulative reasons. But it also highlighted the pattern of adult decision-making that had characterized his entire life at Hogwarts, other people determining what he could handle, what he needed to know, what would serve his best interests. "That should have been my choice to make," Harry said firmly. "My relationship with Snape, my understanding of his motivations, my ability to process information about my own parents, those are things that affect my life directly. I should have been allowed to decide how to handle them." "Perhaps," Dumbledore agreed, his tone suggesting genuine consideration rather than dismissive platitude. "Though I would argue that we all make decisions about what information to share and when to share it, based on our assessment of what others can bear at any given moment." "And who made the assessment that I couldn't bear knowing about my mother's friendship with Snape?" Harry demanded. "Who decided that I was too fragile or too immature to understand that my professor's treatment of me came from grief rather than hatred?" Dumbledore was quiet for a long moment, his blue eyes studying Harry with the kind of careful attention usually reserved for complex magical problems. When he finally spoke, his words carried an honesty that Harry had rarely heard from him. "I did," he said simply. "I made that decision, just as I have made many others regarding the information you receive about your parents, your circumstances, and your role in the conflict with Voldemort. And I made it because I believed, perhaps wrongly, that childhood should be preserved for as long as possible, even in times of war." "But you didn't preserve my childhood," Harry pointed out, his voice thick with accumulated frustration. "You sent me back to the Dursleys every summer knowing how they treated me. You allowed me to face life-threatening challenges from my first year at Hogwarts. You've been preparing me to fight Voldemort since I was 11 years old. So where exactly was this protection of my innocence that you claim to be providing?" The accusation hung between them like a living thing, too large and complex to be easily dismissed or explained away. Harry could see the impact of his words in Dumbledore's expression, in the way the older man's carefully maintained composure cracked slightly to reveal something that might have been regret. "You raise fair points," Dumbledore said finally, "and I suspect they reflect a growing awareness of the complexities and contradictions that characterize adult decision-making in times of crisis. The choices I have made regarding your upbringing and education have been imperfect, to say the least. They've been manipulative," Harry said bluntly. "You've kept me ignorant of information that might have helped me understand the people around me, while simultaneously expecting me to trust your judgment about who deserves my loyalty and cooperation." "Yes," Dumbledore agreed, the simple acknowledgement hitting Harry with unexpected force. "I have been manipulative. I have withheld information, managed relationships, and orchestrated circumstances in ways that served what I believed to be the greater good. And I have done so while maintaining the fiction that my decisions were motivated purely by paternal concern for your welfare. The honest admission should have been satisfying, but instead it left Harry feeling hollow and somehow betrayed. Having his suspicions confirmed was less gratifying than having them dismissed would have been, because confirmation meant accepting that the relationship he had treasured was built on foundations that were more strategic than genuine. "So, what else don't I know?" Harry asked quietly. "What other relationships in my life are based on incomplete information? What other people are playing roles that you've assigned rather than expressing authentic feelings?" "Severus's feelings for your mother are entirely authentic," Dumbledore said gently. "His protection of you, his cooperation with our cause, his willingness to risk his life repeatedly as a spy, all of that comes from his love for Lily, not from any manipulation on my part. But you've used that love," Harry said, understanding flooding through him with uncomfortable clarity. "You've leveraged his grief to ensure his loyalty. You've kept him in a position where he has no choice but to protect me, because failing to do so would betray the memory of the only person who ever mattered to him." Dumbledore nodded slowly, his expression heavy with something that might have been shame. "I have used Severus's love for your mother, as I have used many other relationships and obligations, as tools in a war that requires every advantage we can manage. And I have told myself that the ends justify the means, even when the means involve manipulating people's deepest emotions." The conversation continued for another hour, with Harry pressing for details and Dumbledore offering carefully measured responses that revealed the scope of the deceptions that had shaped Harry's understanding of his world. McGonagall knew about Snape's feelings for Lily, had always known. Lupin was aware of the friendship that had existed between them, though he had been asked to avoid discussing it with Harry. Even Hagrid had been instructed to avoid certain topics and emphasize certain narratives when telling Harry stories about his parents. "Everyone knows more about my life than I do," Harry said finally, his voice flat with exhaustion and disappointment. "Everyone has been given information about my parents, my circumstances, my relationships, while I've been fed carefully edited versions designed to keep me cooperative and manageable." "Not everyone," Dumbledore corrected gently. "There are details that only a very few people know, secrets that could endanger lives if they were shared more broadly. But you are correct that many of the adults in your life have been aware of complexities that we chose not to discuss with you. Because you thought I couldn't handle the truth. Because we thought the truth would be more painful than helpful," Dumbledore replied. "Because we believed that understanding the depth of Severus's feelings for your mother would make your already difficult relationship with him even more complex. Because we assumed that knowledge of the manipulations and strategic decisions that shape this war would burden you unnecessarily." Harry thought about the isolation he had experienced since learning about Snape's love for his mother, about the way understanding had complicated rather than simplified his feelings about the man who had made his life difficult for 6 years. There was some validity to Dumbledore's reasoning, Knowledge did carry its own burdens, did transform relationships in ways that weren't always beneficial. But there was also something deeply troubling about the assumption that other people were qualified to make those decisions for him, that adults had the right to control his understanding of his own life based on their assessment of what he could handle. "What about Snape?" Harry asked suddenly. "Has he been making his own choices in all of this? Or is he as much a prisoner of your manipulations as I am?" The question seemed to surprise Dumbledore, his eyebrows rising slightly at the suggestion that Snape might also be a victim of circumstances beyond his control. "Severus is a complex case," he said finally. "His cooperation with our cause is motivated by genuine remorse for his past choices and authentic love for your mother's memory. But it is also true that his circumstances leave him with very limited options for how to express that love and remorse. Because you've positioned him so that protecting me is the only way he can honor her memory," Harry said, understanding dawning with uncomfortable clarity. "Because you've made sure that failing in his obligations to me would feel like betraying Lily all over again. Severus's obligations to you extend beyond his feelings for your mother," Dumbledore said carefully. "But yes, I have been aware that his love for Lily provides motivation for reliability that might otherwise be lacking." Harry felt a surge of sympathy for Snape that was entirely separate from his own complicated feelings about the man. To spend 20 years trapped in a role that was both necessary and painful, to have your deepest emotions leveraged as tools in someone else's war, to be unable to escape the past because your love for someone dead had been turned into an obligation to someone living. It was a kind of prison that Harry was only beginning to understand. "He can't move on," Harry said quietly. "As long as he's responsible for protecting me, he can't grieve properly or build a life that isn't centered on a relationship that ended 20 years ago." "Perhaps," Dumbledore agreed, "though I would argue that Severus has chosen his path as much as it has been chosen for him. His love for your mother is real, and his desire to atone for his role in her death is authentic. The obligations that bind him to you are not entirely external impositions." But Harry was beginning to see the ways that choice and coercion could be intertwined, the ways that people could be maneuvered into situations where their authentic feelings led them to make decisions that served other people's interests. Snape's love for Lily was real, but it had been shaped and directed in ways that made it useful to Dumbledore's cause. That evening, as Harry made his way back to Gryffindor Tower, through corridors that felt somehow different after his conversation with Dumbledore, he found himself thinking about the nature of the relationships that had shaped his life at Hogwarts. How many of them were authentic expressions of affection or loyalty, and how many were carefully orchestrated arrangements designed to serve the war effort. It was as he passed by the entrance to the dungeons that he encountered Snape, emerging from what appeared to be a lengthy meeting with Dumbledore. The professor looked haggard in a way that went beyond simple tiredness, his usually perfect posture slightly slumped, his face drawn with exhaustion that seemed to encompass years rather than hours. For a moment their eyes met, and Harry saw something in Snape's expression that he had never noticed before, a kind of weary resignation that spoke of someone who had long since stopped expecting his circumstances to change. It was the look of someone who had accepted that his life belonged to obligations and relationships that predated his own choices, that his emotions and loyalty were resources to be managed rather than feelings to be honored. "Potter," Snape said quietly, his voice lacking its usual sharp edge, "you are out rather late for someone who should be preparing for tomorrow's lessons." "So are you, Professor," Harry replied, surprised by his own boldness. Something that might have been a smile flickered across Snape's features. "Indeed. Though I suspect our reasons for wandering the corridors at this hour are rather different." Harry thought about the conversation he had just concluded with Dumbledore, about the web of manipulation and strategic relationships that had been revealed to him. "Maybe not as different as you think," he said quietly. Snape studied him for a long moment, his dark eyes searching Harry's face for signs of meaning beyond the surface words. "Perhaps not," he agreed finally. "The burden of understanding can be isolating, particularly when that understanding reveals complexities that others prefer to leave unexamined." They parted ways without further conversation, but as Harry continued his journey to the common room, he found himself thinking about the strange kinship he had glimpsed in Snape's expression. They were both, in different ways, prisoners of a war that had been fought with their emotions as much as their actions, both trapped in roles that had been defined by other people's assessment of their value and reliability. The realization followed Harry into his dormitory, where his roommates were sleeping peacefully, unaware that their friend was grappling with questions that had no clear answers. As he lay in his bed, staring at the ceiling, Harry found himself thinking about the adults who had shaped his understanding of right and wrong, loyalty and betrayal, love and duty. For 6 years he had trusted Dumbledore's wisdom without question, had accepted the headmaster's explanations about the necessity of certain secrets and the complexity of wartime decision-making. But now, armed with knowledge about the ways that authentic emotions could be leveraged for strategic purposes, Harry was beginning to see his entire life at Hogwarts through a different lens. How much of McGonagall's stern protection was genuine affection, and how much was professional obligation to keep a valuable asset safe? How much of Hagrid's friendship was authentic warmth, and how much was the result of instructions to maintain Harry's trust and cooperation? How much of his own relationships with classmates and teachers was real, and how much was performed for the benefit of observers who needed to believe that Harry Potter was properly integrated into the school community? The questions were uncomfortable and probably unanswerable, but they reflected a fundamental shift in Harry's understanding of the world around him. For the first time since arriving at Hogwarts, he was seeing the castle not as a sanctuary from the complexities of the adult world, but as a carefully constructed stage where authentic emotions were performed alongside strategic deceptions. It was a lonely kind of wisdom, made more isolating by the recognition that most of the people around him, including some of the adults he had trusted most, were probably unaware of the extent to which their relationships had been shaped by considerations beyond simple human connection. As sleep finally claimed him, Harry found himself wondering if this was what growing up truly meant, not the accumulation of knowledge and responsibility, but the gradual recognition that the world was far more complicated and morally ambiguous than the adults in his life had ever allowed him to understand. And perhaps most troubling of all, he was beginning to suspect that his own role in Dumbledore's plans was far more central and far more calculated than he had ever imagined. The boy who lived, the chosen one, the symbol of hope for the wizarding world. These weren't just identities that had been thrust upon him by circumstances beyond anyone's control. They were roles that had been carefully cultivated and maintained, designed to serve purposes that extended far beyond his personal welfare or happiness. Tomorrow, he would have to return to classes, would have to navigate relationships that he now understood to be far more complex than they appeared on the surface. He would have to interact with teachers who knew more about his life than he did, with friends who had never been told the full truth about the war they were all caught up in, with a professor whose protection of him came from love for a woman who had died before Harry could remember her face. But tonight, in the safety of his dormitory bed, Harry allowed himself to grieve for the simpler understanding he had lost, for the time when trust had been uncomplicated and loyalty had been clear, when the adults in his life had seemed wise rather than calculating, and when the war against Voldemort had felt like a struggle between obvious good and clear evil, rather than a complex chess game where everyone's emotions and relationships were potential pieces to be moved and sacrificed as strategy required. Chapter 9. The Half-Blood Prince. Revelation. The discovery began with handwriting, of all things. Harry was reviewing his latest potions essay, a mediocre effort on the theoretical applications of love potions that had earned him a grudging acceptable from Professor Snape, when he noticed something in the margins that made him pause mid-breath. Snape's correction notes were written in his characteristic angular script. precise and economical, in the way that suggested years of practice condensing complex thoughts into minimal space. But there was something familiar about the formation of certain letters, something that tickled the edges of Harry's memory with the persistence of a word balanced on the tip of his tongue. Harry set down the essay and retrieved his copy of Advanced Potion Making from his trunk, the official textbook that had replaced the mysterious Half-Blood Prince's annotated version after the events of the previous year. But his mind wasn't on the pristine pages of the new book. It was on the memory of marginalia that had guided him through his most successful term in potions class. The prince's handwriting had been distinctive, sharp angles and efficient strokes that managed to convey both intelligence and impatience in equal measure. Now, comparing those remembered annotations with Snape's feedback on his essay, Harry felt a cold certainty settle in his stomach like a stone dropped into still water. The handwriting was the same. Not similar. The same. The same formation of capital letters, the same economical approach to punctuation, the same way of abbreviating common potion terms that suggested deep familiarity with the subject matter. Even the tone of the corrections felt familiar, helpful despite their sharpness, designed to improve understanding rather than simply identify errors. Harry's hands began to tremble as he rifled through other essays, other assignments where Snape had provided written feedback. The pattern was unmistakable once he knew what to look for. Every correction, every suggestion, every marginal note bore the distinctive characteristics of the handwriting that had made him the most successful potion student in his year. But it was more than just handwriting that connected the dots in Harry's increasingly racing mind. As he thought back to the prince's most useful annotations, the modified stirring techniques, the ingredient substitutions, the timing adjustments that had transformed his potions from disasters into masterpieces, Harry began to recognize them as variations on methods he had witnessed in Snape's memories of teaching Lily by the lake. The careful attention to temperature control that the prince had emphasized in his notes on Draft of the Dead. Snape had explained that same principle to young Lily, demonstrating how magical ingredients responded differently to heat depending on their preparation. The counterclockwise stirring modification that had saved Harry's amitentia from complete failure. In the memory, teenage Severus had shown Lily that same technique, explaining how it prevented volatile ingredients from overwhelming more delicate ones. The precise timing sequences that had made Harry's Felix Felicis attempt successful beyond all reasonable expectation. Snape had taught those rhythms to Lily during one of their private lessons, emphasizing how potion-making was as much about intuition and timing as it was about following written instructions. Harry felt the blood drain from his face as the full magnitude of the revelation hit him. He hadn't just been using some random former student's textbook. He had been following the guidance of Professor Severus Snape, the man who had made his life miserable for 6 years, who had criticized his every effort, who had seemed to take personal pleasure in his failures. The irony was so profound, it felt like a physical blow. During his most successful term in potions, when he had finally understood the beauty and complexity of the subject, when he had felt genuinely proud of his achievements for the first time since arriving at Hogwarts, he had been learning from Snape. Not the bitter, sarcastic professor who dominated classroom discussions with cutting remarks and impossible standards, but the brilliant, passionate student who had once shared his knowledge freely with the girl he loved. Harry's mind raced backward through the memories of that year, recontextualizing every moment of success in light of this new understanding. The pride he had felt when his potions turned the perfect color, achieved the ideal consistency, produced exactly the effects described in their textbooks. All of it had been built on Snape's foundation, on techniques developed by the man who now seemed to despise everything Harry represented. But did he despise it? The question formed itself before Harry could stop it, carrying with it a flood of uncomfortable implications. If Snape truly hated Harry, if he genuinely wished for his failure and humiliation, why would he have developed methods that made success more achievable? Why would he have created annotations designed to help students understand rather than confuse them? Harry thought about the advanced copy of Advanced Potion Making that had somehow made its way into the supplies cupboard where he had found it. Had it been placed there deliberately? Had Snape, in some twisted way, been trying to help him succeed while maintaining the pretense of antagonism that had characterized their relationship for 6 years? The possibility was deeply unsettling, suggesting as it did that their entire dynamic might be far more complex than Harry had ever imagined. What if Snape's harsh criticism hadn't been motivated by hatred, but by disappointment? What if his cutting remarks reflected frustration with Harry's lack of effort rather than pleasure in his failures? Harry's thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of Hermione, who entered the common room with her arms full of library books and her face bright with the enthusiasm that always characterized her latest research project. "Harry," she said, settling into the chair across from him with the efficiency of someone who had important discoveries to share. "I've been reading about advanced potions techniques, and I've found some fascinating connections between modern methods and historical innovations." "Historical innovations?" Harry repeated, his voice sounding strange to his own ears. "Modifications and improvements that individual practitioners developed over the centuries," Hermione explained, opening one of her books to a page filled with diagrams and annotations. Most of them never made it into official textbooks because they were considered too advanced or too risky for general use. But some of the most brilliant potion makers in history made their reputations by developing techniques that other people couldn't replicate. Harry stared at the open book, seeing the careful diagrams and precise notations that reminded him uncomfortably of the prince's marginalia. What kind of techniques? Timing modifications that increased potion stability, stirring patterns that improved ingredient integration, substitutions that enhanced magical properties while reducing dangerous side effects. Hermione's voice carried the excitement of someone who had discovered a particularly elegant solution to a complex problem. The kind of innovations that suggest deep understanding of magical theory, combined with extensive practical experience. And these techniques, they wouldn't be in student textbooks? "Definitely not," Hermione replied with certainty. "Most of them were developed by master-level practitioners who had spent decades perfecting their understanding of potion making, the kind of knowledge that gets passed down through apprenticeships rather than formal education." Harry felt his certainty about the prince's identity crystallizing into something approaching proof. The techniques in the annotated textbook weren't just clever modifications developed by a gifted student. They were sophisticated innovations that suggested the kind of deep expertise that came from years of advanced study and practice. Snape had that expertise. More than that, he had the kind of passionate engagement with potions that would drive him to constantly refine and improve existing methods. Harry had seen that passion in the memories of his childhood, in the careful way teenage Severus had explained complex concepts to Lily, in the reverent attention he had given to ingredients and their interactions. That evening, as Harry made his way to what had become a regular detention with Professor Snape, officially for failing to properly clean his cauldron after the previous lesson, actually for conversations that both of them seemed to need, but neither could quite acknowledge, he carried with him a new understanding of the man he was about to face. The detention itself followed the familiar pattern that had developed over the past few weeks. Snape set Harry to work on genuinely useful tasks, preparing ingredients that required skill rather than serving purely punitive functions, while maintaining the fiction that this was standard disciplinary action. They worked in companionable silence, the only sounds the soft scraping of knives against cutting boards and the gentle bubbling of potions that continued to brew in the background. But tonight, Harry found himself watching Snape's movements with new attention, looking for connections between the man's current techniques and the innovations he remembered from the prince's textbook. What he saw only reinforced his growing certainty about the identity behind those helpful annotations, the precise knife work that Snape demonstrated while preparing daisy roots. Harry remembered a marginal note about optimal root preparation that had used exactly the same technique, the careful attention to temperature control as Snape adjusted the flames beneath various cauldrons. The prince had emphasized the same principles in his notes about heat-sensitive ingredients, the unconscious efficiency of movement that suggested decades of practice with every aspect of potion preparation. This wasn't just professional competence, it was the kind of fluidity that came from genuine passion for the subject. "You're watching me quite intently tonight, Potter," Snape observed, without looking up from his own work. "Have I developed some fascinating new mannerism that requires such careful study?" Harry felt heat rise in his cheeks at being caught in his observation, but something about Snape's tone, less sharp than usual, almost conversational, encouraged honesty rather than deflection. "I was thinking about potion-making techniques," he said carefully, "about how different approaches to the same process can produce dramatically different results." Snape's hands stilled for a moment before resuming their methodical work. "Indeed? And what has prompted this sudden interest in theoretical applications?" "I've been reading about innovations that individual practitioners developed," Harry continued, drawing on Hermione's research while carefully avoiding direct accusations. Modifications that improved on standard textbook methods through deeper understanding of magical principles. "Ah," Snape's voice carried an undertone that might have been amusement. "And I suppose you've discovered that the most effective techniques are rarely those found in books written for the general student population." "Something like that," Harry agreed. "I've been wondering about why some methods work better than others, about whether the people who develop these innovations do it to help others learn or for more personal reasons." The question hung between them like a bridge that neither was quite ready to cross completely. Snape continued his work for several minutes before responding, his voice carefully controlled, but carrying undertones of something that might have been vulnerability. "Innovation in any field comes from passion," he said finally, "from the kind of deep engagement with a subject that drives a person to constantly question, refine, and improve upon existing knowledge. Those who develop new techniques do so because they cannot bear to see inferior methods persist when better ones are possible. Even if helping others means revealing knowledge that they've worked years to develop?" "Especially then," Snape replied, his voice gaining strength. "Knowledge that is hoarded serves no one. Knowledge that is shared, that has the potential to transform how people understand and interact with the world around them." Harry thought about the half-blood prince's textbook, about the careful annotations that had guided him through his most successful term in potions class. If Snape was indeed the prince, and Harry was now certain that he was, then those notes represented a gift of knowledge that had been given freely, without expectation of credit or recognition. "But what if the person receiving that knowledge doesn't appreciate its source?" Harry asked, thinking of his own attitude toward the prince during 6th year, when he had been so focused on the competitive advantage the book provided that he had never truly considered the generosity of spirit required to create such comprehensive guidance. What if they take the benefits without understanding the motivation behind the gift? Snape looked up from his work, his dark eyes meeting Harry's with an expression that was unreadable but somehow significant. "Then the knowledge has still served its purpose," he said quietly. "The teacher's satisfaction comes from the student's success, not from the student's gratitude." The words carried weight that extended far beyond their surface, meaning, and Harry felt his throat constrict with the recognition of what was being offered. Not quite an admission, but an acknowledgement that transcended the need for explicit confession. "I used your textbook," Harry said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Last year. The one with all the annotations. I didn't know it was yours, but I used it, and I learned from it, and for the first time in 6 years, I actually understood what you were trying to teach us in class." Snape was very still, his expression cycling through what might have been surprise, resignation, and something that looked almost like relief. When he spoke, his voice was carefully controlled, but carried undertones of emotion that Harry had rarely heard from him. "The half-blood prince," he said, and it wasn't quite a question. "Your mother's maiden name was Prince," Harry said, the research pieces falling into place with uncomfortable clarity. "Eileen Prince.